Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's great to see you all again, and thank you so much to our speakers for coming, traveling great distances to come and be with us today. We have a really exciting morning. We have a few panels, beginning with one on psychiatry, and then one on entrepreneurship and writing grant proposals as well. And then we will break into more of hands-on workshops. One for VR beginners, if you will, where you can go and try different equipment, learn how to use it, and learn all about how to get a protocol off the ground. And then we have others in psychiatry and pain and med ed throughout the day. And so we look forward to seeing you all there. And part of what we hope will happen in the panel, in the workshops, is that we'll generate some ideas and perhaps form some new collaborations and to further the goal of integrating the campuses and getting more grants under review broadly across campus and within, of course, within this area, which is a labor of love for Andrea and I and Immersive Media. The first panel is psychiatry. I know I'm listed as a discussant, but again, I'm more of a traffic cop. So if everyone wants to come up, and Dr. Francis Lee, Michelle Pelkovitz, and Melissa Peskin, I'll let them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their expertise. And thank you very much. Was I supposed? Oh, one other thing. I'm sorry. I'm holding this and I completely forgot. I just want to mention, if you love VR after this, there are going to be some upcoming conferences that will be fabulous. One is March 2nd and 3rd, 2020 at Vanderbilt University. It's the 4th annual VR and healthcare symposium. I have participated in other ones as both a speaker and a guest, and they're fabulous. Lots of other speakers from around the country and around the world, and good demos of cutting edge stuff. And then another one in Dublin by the same group on December 5th and 6th. Thanks very much.
Let's see. So first of all, thank you so much, Joanne, for organizing this. I think this is a much needed symposium to have. And I think just from my perspective, I'm a developmental neurobiologist and also the chair of psychiatry here at Cornell, is that this is probably, I hope we're getting to a tipping point within the field of psychiatry where we can ultimately leverage the various advances that are being made in digital technologies, as well as in neurobiology at some point, to hopefully move the needle on a variety of psychiatric disorders. And it really is, I think, these types of meetings where we get to collaborate and meet others who are outside the sort of our narrow field of psychiatry, psychology, and meet with others that will help us sort of think about our problems in a different way. And just on a personal note, I've been working with Joanne for the last 15 years in many of her VR studies, in particular with the World Trade Center, as well as those involving veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And it really has sort of imbued the way I've been thinking about my other preclinical research. And you'll see here, I'm just going to give you a very short vignette of a neurobiology story and about how thinking about immersive technologies and VR has helped inform how I've shifted my neurobiology related research, and how I think hopefully I'll be able to show how it can inform future immersive technology research. So first of all, I wanted to point out what I consider a little bit of a paradox about psychiatry, that like when I see my patients in the clinic, I still see patients with anxiety disorders and PTSD, is that I see them probably 7 to 10 years after their disorder emerged. Almost the vast majority of psychiatric disorders emerge during a time frame that spans childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood. Essentially, by then you will have been diagnosed with the psychiatric disorder. So we are studying essentially a disorder that is affecting the developing brain versus the developed brain. And it's just something to keep in mind, that while our mindset of how we think about treating is treating a static brain that has been matured. And so the idea that my collaborators and I have been thinking about is that why is it that everything emerges during this period between the transition between adolescence and adulthood, essentially? The die has essentially been cast. And so the hypothesis that we've had for the last several years is there must be a period of heightened plasticity where that confers some heightened vulnerability. But implicit in this hypothesis is that there are obviously then going to be opportunities to leverage that plasticity in some way. And in many ways, this is sort of the idea that what it suggests is that the brain is essentially rapidly reorganizing itself during this transition period and is obviously more vulnerable to various insults. And obviously, the human correlate that I've been focused on in my neurobiology research has been mainly in PTSD and anxiety disorders. And so just as a very simple diagram, but this is for the last 40 to 50 years, this is how we've modeled fear and anxiety in mouse models. We essentially do single paired tones with shocks. So essentially, this is Pavlovian learning, that you pair a tone with a shock, then subsequently the next day you bring back the mouse to a different chamber and you play the tone again, and the tone will elicit the exact same freezing response as if you shock the animal. And so this is what's called fear acquisition, cued fear acquisition. But what I really want to focus on is this different part of fear regulation, where then for the next 4 to 5 days, you bring the mouse back into the same chamber and play the tone over and over again. And this is what's called fear extinction. The mouse will ultimately learn that this tone that was previously dangerous is no longer dangerous. And the reason why this is so important is that this is the sort of the bedrock learning theory by which all the current treatments for anxiety disorders, in particular PTSD, for example, are based on. This is what has been brought up before. Cognitive behavioral therapy is basically based on these principles of exposure to previously dangerous cues and then subsequent extinction of those cues. And so that this is what has, and the circuitry of this has been well worked out in terms of in both in humans and in rodents. And so this is something that has been well known. And what my lab started about 4 to 5 years ago was ask a very simple question. In the developing mouse, is fear regulation altered across development? And this was just a simple study where what we did was we measured freezing on day 1 and then subtracted the amount of freezing on day 4. So if you look at a sort of an extinction index, the higher the bar, for example, if this is a pre-adolescent mouse, suggests that there is greater fear extinction. And what we noticed, and which really surprised us, is it looked as if adolescent mice were unable to extinguish fears as efficiently as pre-adolescent mice or adult mice. And this was sort of very odd. And it also sort of flew in the face of how we thought about that this was a period of heightened plasticity, heightened learning, and during adolescence. But we wanted to convince ourselves that this was not just something that we could find in mice. My colleague BJ Casey, when she was here, did a parallel human study where instead of shocking little children, she played a loud noise and paired it with a yellow square and did the exact same type of fear extinction paradigm, and showed that pre-adolescent humans controls without any anxiety disorders were able to extinguish this sort of association between a yellow square and a loud noise. And the way she did that was she measured galvanic skin response. So as they were being flashed yellow squares, they stopped sweating as much. But then if you have adolescents, they continue to be quite afraid of this yellow square. And it again suggests a parallel sort of change in the way the adolescent or young adult brain is handling these types of fear cues. And so this is probably a slide that summarizes about 40 years of work. It's well known that, for example, when these tones are being played, that there are the sensory cortex basically projects to an area of the subcortical region called amygdala, which then leads to a low fear response. But then as the tones are being played over and over again, a region of the prefrontal cortex essentially suppresses the amygdala. And so this is how normal fear extinction works, but somehow during adolescence, something seems to have gone offline. And in many ways, this was very puzzling to us for many years. And the way we ultimately sort of solved this puzzle was that we were able to collaborate with a very talented group of neuroscientists, in particular Carl Deiseroth at Stanford, and a faculty member now at Cornell, Connor Liston. And so what they were able to do, this almost sounds science fiction-y when I first heard it, they were able to put a prism the size of Lincoln's nose on the contralateral prefrontal cortex and essentially measure the growth and formation and elimination of connections in the prefrontal cortex across the entirety of adolescence in these mice. And that what they were able to do is count the number of synapses that are formed, as well as figure out where the projections to the prefrontal cortex were coming from. And to make a long story short, they found that contrary to the idea that as you mature, you're pruning synapses, they actually saw a surge in synapse formation in this one particular region in the prefrontal cortex, suggesting that there is this hyperplastic sort of rearrangement of connectivity between various brain regions with the prefrontal cortex. And what data I'm not going to show you, but ultimately what Connor was able to find was that there are projections from the amygdala that go to a very specific part of the prefrontal cortex that maintain fear expression. So basically, so that under normal conditions, the amygdala doesn't send that many projections to the prefrontal cortex. So in many ways, this is probably why these adolescent mice were having such great difficulty extinguishing fear. The amygdala had come online. And so that essentially you have increases in this one area so that you cannot sort of stop suppressing this fear response because of the heightened activity and connectivity of the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. Again, and what I'm telling you does not seem to be something that would be helpful to understand in terms of trying to decrease fear. So it just suggests that this explains why we had such great difficulty in these animals, in these mice, as well as in the humans, potentially of why they were not able to extinguish fear to cues. But what Connor was able to find was there was another connection with another brain region called the hippocampus, which is much more involved in spatial memory and spatial location. And this usually has been well established to suppress this fear-expressing area of the prefrontal cortex, and it sends an inhibitory projection, and it also is hyper-connecting during adolescence. So then this was around the same time that I'm seeing patients with Joanne in virtual for her VR studies, and I asked my students and postdocs, can't we just re-expose our mice to not the cue, the tone, but actually the chamber with which they had actually received the shocks? And so we're doing essentially a contextual extinction. This is somewhat different than what normally the standard extinction paradigm. So essentially you're putting them back into the place that they had been previously shocked. And this is a very busy slide, but what we did was we essentially gave the contextual extinction session right after shocking them. And then we did a very important test, something called a reinstatement test, which is to shock them again. And if you had normal mice that basically received fear conditioning and were given an additional shock, they would exhibit very high freezing responses. But as you see here, the mice that had been given the contextual extinction basically forgot that they had been previously shocked. So essentially, this is as close as you get to something that what we would call fear erasure. And what was even more stunning was that if we actually played the tone within this chamber, we would also get erasure or significant attenuation of the cued fear, which suggests that this is one mechanism with which you can actually significantly attenuate fears. And it suggests that there's this hidden plasticity within the hippocampus during adolescence that had not previously been known. And I think this is sort of the way I think we should be thinking about in the future about how we treat our patients, because we always talk about personalized medicine, but one way to personalize it would to actually be based on the developmental state of the brain, and it suggests that during adolescence that there is a period of heightened plasticity, and that, for example, that you can use novel evidence-based interventions such as virtual reality-based treatments, and this is just a segue into Michelle's talk, but essentially this has led us to begin to think about, for this population of adolescents and young adults, that this might be a more effective way or a different way of trying to tap into different ways to attenuate anxiety and fear. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for setting the stage so nicely to talk about the translation of your preclinical work into a clinical population. And you've already sort of heard about the basics of my study, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about how Dr. Lee's findings dovetail so nicely into the design of the study and really change the way that we think about treatment of anxiety disorders in teens. So I'm actually going to start by talking about a young man that I used to work with. His name is Josh. He's 19, and he has struggled with anxiety since his pre-adolescence. He was never really went to treatment. He was always sort of subclinical, doing okay. But then when he started college, he really struggled. His anxiety worsened significantly. He reported that he felt like campus was just opportunity after opportunity to embarrass himself. He felt like he was being scrutinized everywhere he went. He was particularly uncomfortable in large lecture halls and in classes where he felt like he could be called on at any moment. He did go to parties and socialize, but he often felt very anxious and would sometimes get very drunk in order to kind of tolerate the experience of the anxiety. And he really stopped going to parties after an experience where he asked a woman out in front of a few of his friends and she rejected him, and he was very embarrassed. After that time, he sort of started to withdraw socially. He was spending all of his time in his dorm room. He eventually stopped going to classes. Obviously, his academics were severely impacted. He became quite depressed, and he was actually suicidal, and he ended up having to take medical leave from school. And unfortunately, Josh's story is not uncommon. It's very similar to the story that we hear from a lot of our patients in the Youth Anxiety Center. A lot of young adults, particularly those who were untreated, up until their late adolescence, sort of go down this trajectory. And as I mentioned yesterday, the good news is that we do have a treatment that works, cognitive behavioral therapy, and the Child Adolescent Anxiety Multimodal Study, or CAMS, sort of shows us that a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy with an SSRI shows an 81% response rate. So people do very well when they're in treatment. But when you look at what happens with CBT alone, 40% of individuals are not responding to our front line. This is what we have. This is the best of what we have. And many of those are adolescents, and they're just not showing as robust a response to exposure as we would like. And this is sort of further compounded by the fact that CBT is unfortunately not accessible to everyone. So we sort of have to think about what can we do to CBT, which I'm going to explain a little bit more in detail what CBT is, but what can we do to CBT in order to make it more accessible and also more effective for adolescents? And this is obviously where the stuff that we learned from Dr. Lee's work comes in. We assume that part of the reason that adolescents aren't responding quite as well to exposure is because of this attenuated fear or the fear extinction learning differences that they have with the other age groups. And also we hope that contextual learning will sort of change that. And that's sort of where VR comes in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what exposure therapy is, particularly for a socially anxious population. So I'll go into detail about sort of the ins and outs of CBT, but exposure therapy specifically is sort of taking the model of fear extinction learning that Dr. Lee described and applying it in a therapy office. So what we would do is we would try to help the adolescent over time and with repeated exposure, to stop pairing this non-threatening stimulus or a social interaction with this fear response. So every time they go into a social interaction, they feel like they are in danger, when in actuality, they're not. And with repeated exposure to that stimulus of social interaction with no negative outcome or with no dangerous outcome, over time, they should extinguish their fear. But like we said, this is unfortunately not happening quite as robustly in adolescence as we want it to, which is where virtual reality exposure therapy comes in. So we talked enough about the evidence base of VR exposure therapy here, so you know about this. I'm just going to talk a little bit about how social anxiety is maintained in the absence of treatment, and how CBT, and specifically CBT plus virtual reality, can sort of address that. So does this pointer work? I realized I should have asked you. Oh, this one. Okay, so let's imagine Josh. He walks into a party and he immediately sees a young woman who is making a neutral face. She has a neutral expression on her face, but he misinterprets that neutral expression as a look of disgust or rejection. And so his memory of that recent interaction that he had where he was rejected is sort of triggered, and he starts to feel fear, a fear response. He starts sweating, his heart starts racing, he starts breathing rapidly, and he has the urge to avoid. So he naturally will either go and drink heavily, or he'll go into a corner and he'll take out his phone, and his fear reaction will decrease. He'll start to feel less afraid and less uncomfortable because he's no longer having to engage in that social interaction that was making him feel so bad. And that feels great. But what it does is it deprives him of the opportunity to have a corrective experience. And that corrective experience is where that extinction learning comes in. What CBT does is instead encourages, in the presence of this arousal and this urge to avoid, we encourage patients to gradually expose themselves to these feared stimuli. So in a situation like this, I would say, okay, Josh, instead of looking at your phone, at least keep your head up and make eye contact with at least one person. And then maybe at the next party, you'll actually initiate a conversation with a male peer that you are comfortable with. And then maybe at the next party, you'll be able to start a conversation with someone who's less comfortable. And over time and with repeated exposure, we see extinction learning. So this is the basic idea of CBT. And I realize I forgot to put this here, sorry. So in our study, we're sort of trying to address the critical parts of this whole model. So in one of the things that we're doing is we're looking at extinction learning by having the participants engage in an extinction computer task, which is similar to what Dr. Lee described. So it's a computer task. The participants basically pair neutral shapes on a screen with an aversive stimulus. For our study, it's a puff of air. We measure their galvanic skin response, their heart rate, and their heart rate variability. And then they engage in 10 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy plus VR. And the CBT has sort of a couple of components, but the first is coping skills. So we teach them relaxation and mindfulness skills, cognitive coping skills, so different ways to engage with their negative thoughts, their worries, social skills and assertiveness skills, particularly targeted at helping participants to know how to engage in an environment with their substance use and how to say no. And then virtual reality exposure. And we're using the virtual environments, again, for exposure and also for opportunities for skills rehearsal. And the hope is that over time, we'll see fear extinction, or at least an increased tolerance of that discomfort so that this avoiding coping doesn't happen anymore. And then we do reassessment. And on the next slide, I have the sort of layout of what the study visit by visit is, but we can talk about that another time if anyone's interested. I don't know if anyone needs to hear the visit by visit. So you already saw this video. I'm going to show it to you again because I want you to sort of think about what it might feel like as Josh to go into this party in a totally immersive, you're completely immersed, you're in an Oculus head-mounted display, and what this might feel like.
Hey, come on in. I'm Marcia. What's your name? Nice to meet you. Make yourself at home.
Okay, and then I'm also going to show you, so this is a conversation between one of the avatars and a socially anxious participant who is me pretending to be a socially anxious participant. So you'll have to forgive my poor acting. Oh.
Hey again.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good.
So what's going on?
Oh, well, I've just been catching up with some friends. Did you meet anyone fun?
Not really.
I'm thinking of jumping in the pool. Want to come?
I don't have my bathing suit here.
Oh, don't let that stop you.
No, I think I'm gonna pass.
Let's go.
And if you come to the workshop a little later, you'll learn how that came to be. It's not quite as simple as you might think. There was a little bit of creative problem solving that went into the voice acting and dubbing the voice and everything like that. So we can talk a little bit more about that later. But that's basically it. Right now, the study is ongoing. We have already run a few participants, and we have some really nice qualitative feedback. Especially consider some of the challenges that we've had with the environment. I've been very pleased to hear that participants are, subjectively reporting, feeling very immersed, and that the exposures are achieving a similar result as what I see in my private practice and with in vivo exposures. And as far as what's next, obviously, if this pilot proves to be, feasible, then the next step would be an RCT where we would establish efficacy and effectiveness. I would love to be able to explore the neurobiological mechanisms in a human clinical population a little bit more so we can understand how Dr. Lee's work kind of translates on a neurobiological level in a human clinical population that's undergoing treatment in VR. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much to Drs. Lee and Pelkovitz for providing such a wonderful introduction. So I am going to actually skip through a couple of my slides that talk a little bit about extinction learning since it's been covered in such depth. And I'm really going to focus today specifically on the application of virtual reality exposure therapy to post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. So very briefly, we've talked a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder, but just for the non-clinical audience, what is PTSD? It's a psychiatric disorder that can develop in some individuals following exposure to, actual or threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. There are 4 symptom clusters consisting of intrusive symptoms, avoidance symptoms, changes in mood and thoughts, and alterations in arousal and reactivity. Okay, so as Drs. Lee and Pelkovitz have discussed, when we're talking about disorders involving fear, what we're really talking about, and particularly with something like PTSD, is that PTSD can be conceptualized as a disorder of learned fear. And what do I mean when I say learned fear? Well, specifically, during the occurrence of a traumatic event, people learn to fear all of the cues. Cues are sight, sound, smells, the place, the time of day, anything that's present in the environment, the context, right? People learn to fear all of the things that are associated with the traumatic event. And then they start to avoid those things. So we have 2 types of learning. We have kind of classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning, and then we have instrumental conditioning, which is involved in avoiding those same cues. The problem is that, as Michelle just talked about, avoidance is reinforcing. As soon as you start avoiding things, your arousal initially declines, but then over time, you continue to be avoidant and the fear remains high. You never learn that some of those things, such as a sight or a sound or a smell, isn't actually a good indicator of danger. And in PTSD in particularly, this avoidance tends to generalize. So it stops specifically being associated with just the cues that are present in the environment at the time of the trauma and starts spreading, such that a worldview evolves that the world is just dangerous. I can't keep myself safe. Okay. So the reason this is important is that if PTSD is a disorder of learned or conditioned fear, then treatment needs to extinguish this fear response. And as has been discussed, what we're talking about with extinction really is that repeated exposure to the feared stimulus. So in this case, the trauma memory or actual cues that were present in the environment, such as a person who might resemble someone's attacker, time of day, place, things like that, without actual harm befalling the individual, should lead to habituation and extinction. Okay, exposure therapy is simply repeated therapeutic activation of the trauma memory or repeated activation of the fear memory and fear to cues, fear to the actual trauma memory in the absence of aversive events, should lead to kind of a reconditioning or a form of new learning, corrective learning to be encoded such that individuals no longer are having that same fear response. And in particular, it's really important when we're talking about PTSD that the individual is emotionally engaged, that they're experiencing some degree of fear in order for this newer corrective information to be encoded. And there's research showing that individuals who are emotionally engaged do better in exposure therapy for PTSD than those who aren't. Okay, so in summary, exposure therapy is essentially extinction training. All right, the best known example of this is prolonged exposure. Essentially what we're doing here is an individual is recounting their worst traumatic event out loud to their therapist repeatedly in order to promote extinction and corrective learning. There's also in vivo exposure where individuals face objectively safe cues that are associated with the trauma in order to promote extinction. Okay. Where does VR come in? It's really hard to do this. If you think about the worst thing that ever happened to you, and particularly if the worst thing that ever happened to you is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, you would want to avoid that, right? Avoidance is inherent to PTSD. It's one of you have to have an avoidant symptom in order to meet criteria. And so many patients don't want to enter treatment. When they do, they have a really hard time queuing up or bringing up the emotions that are associated with their traumatic event. And even if they say they can do it, a lot of times they're pretty numb and withdrawn. And that's important because you need to have that emotional engagement in order to benefit from the treatment. Okay, so this is where VR comes in. And when we think about VR for PTSD, what we're really thinking about here is that VR is used as a tool to facilitate extinction learning. VR is really providing an opportunity to engage the senses in a different way. So typically when we are in psychotherapy, we're verbally communicating our experiences, but the ability to have visual, auditory, olfactory, haptic stimuli and integrate those multisensory cues may be really helpful for trauma memories. Trauma memories are typically sensory fragmented memories. And by engaging all of these multisensory components in the virtual reality, we are able to facilitate that emotional engagement to potentially overcome avoidance and to enhance learning. VR may also be useful in terms of helping individuals who have a hard time effortfully recalling their trauma memory. Another nice aspect of VR is that you can have graded exposure. So rather than someone just recounting all of the details of their trauma from the get-go, the therapist can customize the virtual environment such that increased auditory cues, for instance, or visual effects happen with each telling of the trauma narrative. It's also really sometimes impractical to do in vivo exposure in the real world. And there's also research showing that patients prefer VR. Okay. There's also research saying that VR may be particularly appealing to younger service members, to the younger population who might be more attracted to that. And that's really important for something like PTSD, where a big part of the struggle is getting people into treatment. Okay, I know Dr. DeFede talked a little bit about this in her opening remarks yesterday. Thus far, there have been virtual environments developed for PTSD stemming from a variety of traumas. Here's a couple pictures. The one on the top right is virtual Vietnam. Here's some of Dr. DeFede and her colleagues' work with virtual World Trade Center. And finally, on the bottom, virtual Iraq, which I'm going to talk very briefly about for a minute. Okay. And research has demonstrated that VR is safe, tolerable, and effective for PTSD stemming from a multitude of traumatic events. And now I just want to spend 1 or 2 minutes talking a little bit specifically about virtual reality exposure therapy for combat-related PTSD. There's been a lot of research showing that this is safe, effective, and tolerable. just see where the video is that I want to show. Okay, it's coming up. How does it fare compared to exposure therapy? If you're thinking of the standard comparison of prolonged imaginal exposure versus virtual reality exposure therapy, there's been one large study in an active duty population, which found that there were no significant differences between the two conditions at post-treatment. Patients who got prolonged exposure did slightly better at 3 and 6 month follow-up. We just completed a 7-year randomized clinical trial, and that's what I want to play a little clip from and talk a little bit more detail about. Okay, this was conducted in conjunction with Dr. Lee, collaborators at Emory and at USC, Institute for Creative Technologies.
Friends go through.
When you hear some of the stories that people tell about their experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, the variety of things that affect people are unimaginable.
First time I came under fire, it was in 2006, going up and down a road called MSR Tampa in Iraq. Your first reaction isn't really feelings, it's instinct, and you just respond off instinct.
Okay, so you'll be putting on this head-mounted display.
Oh, wow.
I've just turned on the vibration.
Yeah. That feels a lot more real.
On the convoy that I was injured on, I wasn't with my unit. I was detached to do a separate mission to escort a specific general. And our mission was to play security team. And on the way back, there was an IED attack. Our vehicle ran over an IED. So the vehicle exploded.
We really try to draw on the feedback we get from patients going through this and the stories that they tell to make it a richer experience.
You couldn't tell it was a truck anymore. It was just like a big ball of metal. Never met the person that saved my life. I didn't remember his name. And I didn't know the soldier that was lost as well. I just remember waking up in Germany.
I think the key here is diversity. To be able to have a variety of contexts that can address the wide range of experiences that people come back that they say are the things they remember and that, haunt them.
So when I woke up days later, couldn't feel my legs, couldn't move my head left or right. So I didn't know if I was quadriplegic, paraplegic. I didn't know what was going on until the nurse explained it to me. I was having a hard time sleeping. I was having a lot of nightmares and just memories and flashes. So they diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress. I didn't have a fortitude to seek help. I didn't seek help either. I was told I had to seek help.
So what we do is we have the person go over their memory as if it were happening again, but they're in a safe environment.
So I did that with therapists. I'd have to talk myself through the situation over and over and over again to lower my anxiety level, to lower my adrenaline levels.
The challenge is with traditional exposure, if you can't engage a person using exclusive imagination, then you don't see the treatment effect because they're so walled off from their emotions. Let me pop you into a city environment or jump into a market area.
Yeah, I can see you've got the fruit, vegetable stands, all the trash in the street, which is pretty realistic.
Where virtual reality comes in is it basically delivers the context for your memory and the imagery, the sights, the sounds, the smells of being in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Like, I hear all these layers.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there and go to the next slide. So in this study, which is currently under review, so I'm not allowed to talk about the findings, but I just want to spend a minute going to kind of the next point here and where VR is really going to play an important role, which is that we know VR is effective for PTSD, but I guess the next frontier is really thinking, moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach to treatment and thinking about which treatment is best for whom. And that's not a new idea. That idea has been around for a long time, but now there are a lot of more sophisticated approaches that can help us get at this question. And so thinking about precision medicine, the precision medicine initiative, personalized medicine, things like that, taking into account individual variability in genes, environment, lifestyle, to predict which treatment will work for whom. And there's also a lot of really sophisticated statistical techniques that can help with this, such as a recent reanalysis of one of the major comparisons of PE and VRA to see which variables would predict who would do better in which treatment. So I think the question then shifts to, is virtual reality exposure therapy more effective than prolonged exposure therapy for certain patients? And who are these patients? We could make some guesses, right? Perhaps patients who are more numb or avoidant, patients who are underengaged, but what are the other characteristics that differentiate who would do better in which treatment? And I know that I can't talk about any findings from this big study that was recently concluded. But I will say that another important area, and I am allowed to say this, I think, is that when you think about another advantage that VR has, it has to do with patient preference. And so in this recent study, approximately 75% of individuals preferred VR to prolonged exposure. Okay, so in sum, I think the future and the next wave of research is really going to help us determine which patient characteristics are important in predicting which patients will do better with which treatment, and then doing a better job of matching patients to treatments in future. Thank
We have time for questions this morning, which is great. We did yesterday. So, and just remind you, I want to have you use the microphone so that people in Ithaca can hear. Does anybody have any questions for our panel? Thank you very much. That was a really fascinating presentation. Yes. Here. I'm not wearing my glasses, so if you wouldn't mind. Thanks.
Thank you so much for such wonderful discussions. I actually have a question about one of your final points, Dr. Peskin. And I know that maybe you're not so, I know that there's some hesitation about going into kind of the findings of your most recent study, but I'm so interested in that patient preference. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about kind of the factors that were contributing to those preferences.
You sure?
Yeah. Sure. Absolutely. Well, I don't know that I can speak to the findings from our recent study, particularly in that regard. But I know that there, particularly among younger veterans, younger service members, there is an interest in kind of technology. I think technology is appealing. It's kind of sexy. It sounds interesting to people. And I know there's research kind of suggesting that that might be motivating or help individuals in overcoming some of the barriers to traditional therapy, which I think is often thought of as kind of dry and unappealing. And so I'm using other research and bringing that in without directly talking about the findings from our study.
Right.
There was also a very recently published study in 2018 showing that, this is a little bit different, but it's talking about patient preferences, and it wasn't specifically about VR, but it was talking about that patient preference is, it was looking at patients who were randomized to prolonged exposure therapy or a medication for PTSD, but they were doubly randomized. So they first were asked which their preference was in terms of treatment, and preference was related to outcome. And so it actually matters what patients want. It is related to how they do in the treatment. It's associated with satisfaction. It's associated with a lot of other features. We were just talking last night a little bit about when this will start to be taken into account in terms of the standard of care in psychiatry.
And I can also tell you anecdotally with my population, teenagers, I've had a lot of participants who have come to me through the recruitment means that we're using, which is primarily now social media, who have said that they're treatment naive. They've never been in treatment before. They've been suffering with clinical levels of anxiety for a long time, and that the virtual reality angle was what sort of brought them over the threshold into treatment.
Thank you for this fascinating discussion. I was curious if you would expect, this is kind of for all of you, and kind of bridging off of the mouse work that you discussed, Dr. Lee, but would you expect the virtual reality therapy could disrupt that adolescent-based connectivity pattern between the prefrontal cortex and the sort of midbrain? If you could, I guess you would have to do maybe some neuroimaging in those virtual environments.
That's a great question. Yes, so we would love to be able to, at some point, be able to do neuroimaging and to see whether or not we can actually see what I would anticipate is that we would see activation of the hippocampus and then subsequent suppression of the amygdala. So so whether it goes to the prefrontal cortex or directly suppressing it. But I think this is a great area to investigate, because it seems like this is something has been not fully thought through by other researchers at this point.
Agreed. It's a technical problem now. You can't have the medium in a magnet. So that's why it hasn't been done yet. But great question. Thank you. Well, I think we have time for one more question, maybe. So, if I may ask, so if we reimagine, should we reimagine, based on your preclinical findings, do you think we should reimagine the next VR? This is for all of you. Since the average, our service members who go into the Army, 18 to 24 is a common time for entering the service. Should we be thinking about using the VR more in a contextual environment than Q-specific extinction? Or here's another really controversial question: should we be delaying military service until after age 24? I think you take either question, whichever.
First of all, definitely after the age of 18 to 22 it's been well established that the prefrontal cortex is still not developed. So you can imagine that if you're sort of still under construction in many ways. But I think that this really suggests that this might be an area where you, first of all, obviously this population will be much more engaged, and that we will hopefully get a bigger bang for our buck in terms of the number of sessions might be decreased, and also it is something that it's a brain region that has not yet been fully tapped. And you're right, possibly decreasing cues and increasing more contextually enriched components of it might actually be more important. That would be one way to think about optimizing it.
So Melissa, our next grant?
I was just thinking, so adolescents, PTSD.
Right. So I think we have a grant proposal right here. Well, thank you all very, very much for a really, really engaging discussion. Next, we have a reprise of entrepreneurship and immersive media with Dr. Walter Greenleaf, who is a neuroscientist and entrepreneur from Stanford and Silicon Valley, and has earned his credentials in beginning before VR was a word, and has both done research to validate VR, and now advises a lot of companies in the entrepreneur space. And Chris Chen, who was the director of medical content at HTC Vive. I think he has a different role now, but they're both going to talk about entrepreneurship, and they're here all the way from the left coast, so we particularly are grateful for them to making such a long trip on our behalf. Thank you.
Why don't you go first? Okay. Chris is going to be loading his slides now, so I'll jump in and make a few comments. As I mentioned yesterday to those of you who were here, I think this is a really optimal time for entrepreneurship in this arena. And by entrepreneurship, I don't necessarily mean you need to depart from the academic arena and go do a startup. By entrepreneurship, I mean forging new ground, and that can be within your research zone, of course.
Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. Continue if you like.
Well, I'll conclude my thoughts. There's a lot going on behind the scenes in terms of both the power and the next generation of this technology. Now, Chris probably knows many things that he can't tell us. Maybe he can imply a few things, but I'm very excited about what the next few years will bring in terms of both the affordances of interactive immersive technology and also what we'll be able to do with it both in an educational context, in a research context, and in a therapeutic context.
Thanks, Walter. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context and background around VR and the landscape of VR. You may or may not know, but we've been in this is really the third age of VR. It's kind of come up in the 60s, again in the 90s, and now it's back. So is it back for good? That's the question. And I think the answer is yes. This really is not really an exhaustive list, but it's a landscape map by one of the foremost VR investors, the VR Fund, and Tipitat Srinivasan is the person who puts this together. He scouts startup companies and the industry as a whole. But you can see that this is really the view from what is really required for the VR ecosystem to succeed. You need to have foundational layers, you need to have platforms, infrastructure, tools, and content. And you can see verticals on top. So this area right here is healthcare. Now this was actually from 2015, and you can see there are about 14 startups and companies in that space. A few months later, you can see that this bucket looks a little bit smaller. Actually, the square isn't correct. It should extend to the top, but it's about 9 different companies, and I think he categorized some more verticals. So it doesn't really represent shrinkage in the market from a few months, but you can start seeing there's growth. So 2 months later, you get to be about 13 or so companies. The following year, you see a lot more logos, a lot more growth. The font starts getting smaller. Some of these companies still look familiar. Some of them are new. Some of them have dropped out. And it gets more and more crowded. So 22, then you start adding Europe. You get into your 30s last year. And again, this is now by no means exhaustive, but I think it's representative of the space, the growth that's going on, primarily driven by startup companies, but of course, large companies investing as well. And 33 this year in VR. This is just from a few months ago. And now AR, of course, has made its way to the landscape and has this deserving of its own map. So you start getting upwards of 50 or so in this space. And of course, Walter has talked about 200, and really there are a lot more than this. But I would look at this as a proxy, really representative of more of what the growth is looking like. Now for AR, I know we've talked a little bit about it. We talked mostly about VR. AR is technologically still about 3 to 5 years behind VR due to optics technology, the complexity of form factor, battery, and ensuring that you can actually get a really good experience. And it will come, but it's just not there yet. It's there now, but it's really not the way we anticipate it to be in a few years. How many of you guys have heard of the Gartner hype cycle? Okay, so it's really kind of Gartner issues this report every year. They really map the various future technologies along this curve, and you can see there's various stages of kind of hype, right? So in the beginning, there's the innovation stage, then the press starts getting onto it, the analysts start jumping on board and make wild predictions, and you get this really peak of inflated expectations. This happened around 2015, 2016, when VR started taking off and launched. And everyone is saying it's going to be bigger than your phones. It's going to take over within 3 years. Everyone will have a headset. I would even venture to say that one of our executives said there'll be 8 billion headsets in 2020. So he was clearly living in the this realm of heightened inflated expectations. And then we kind of came to this trough of disillusionment where it kind of crashed and burned. People thought VR was dying. You really didn't have the adoption rates in the consumer space. The hardware was still expensive. There wasn't enough content out there. And that was a little bit, for entrepreneurs especially, it was a very challenging time. You saw companies that were all in VR, move out of VR, or they just sold, or they pivoted. And now we're kind of in this, according to 2017, we're on the path of enlightenment. We're back up the slope of enlightenment. We're kind of aligning expectations with reality. And I would say that we're still on that path. We're not really kind of out of the clear yet, but we are getting obviously a lot of legitimacy around enterprise adoption, healthcare, of course. That's why we're all here. So we're not out of the woods, but I think we passed that tipping point, and there's a lot of opportunity ahead. So last week, or about a week or two ago, Digit Capital mentioned that startup valuations for VR, AR startups have reached almost $100 billion, half of $100 billion on paper. So is this really a good time to be a VR entrepreneur? Well, it depends. So in this accounting of the market size, about 18 companies comprise half the valuation. Magic Leap's, a big AR company, 6 billion. Niantic, you've heard of if you know Pokemon Go. And of course, Oculus was purchased by Facebook. So it really is, there's a lot of concentration at the high end or the top end. There still is funding among startup companies, but it really kind of depends again. So China comprised about 2.5 times the amount of investment this year than other countries. And the government has made it a mandate for VR to be a strategic competitive advantage or strategic initiative for them, for the entire country. So they're very much policy driven, and they're putting their money, kind of money where their mouth is right now. So that might be helpful if you're thinking about being an entrepreneur. And most importantly is, how do you scale? Because I think that's going to be the key question I'll come back to when we talk about funding as well. If you are really trying to grow, you need to have the distribution in place and the partnerships in place to do so. So I'm gonna show you a video of a company that some of you know. It's called Realitier. And this is a company that actually is in our ViveX portfolio. So you can see it actually looks very enjoyable for mindfulness. I mean, the quality of the experience is beautiful. They had some really nice features, but they're no longer a going entity. So it's unfortunate. And why is that? So let's kind of, I'm going to borrow something from Walter. He's kind of talked about this, and he might bring it up again, but when you think about success in healthcare, medicine, and VR, there's 3 pillars, really. One is you need to have really kind of the medical rigor behind it. You need to have evidence-based backing, validation. Obviously, having a development team or developers, artists, creative directors, designers that can take the therapy or the application, make it relevant. I think So-Young and a few others talked about this yesterday more in depth, about having the right usability, the right user experience that can resonate with patients. And then ultimately the business, right? You need to be able to kind of have a business model that grows. And I can't emphasize that enough, right? If I can leave 3 things with you, and I'm talking not from a clinical standpoint or research standpoint, but it's a business model, and the business model. And what I mean by that is, you need to have this sustainable or really strategic competitive advantage, because sustainability is not really as relevant these days. The market moves too quickly. There's a lot of funding going on. There are a lot of disruptive technologies. Nothing's really standing still. So you need to have some form of either IP, research behind it. And I think what I've seen a lot of is just really kind of the entrepreneurs that have survived have really hustled. They've really hustled to scale. They really hustled to partner. And just having that partnership and that distribution and way to get it out there in the field has been kind of really their livelihood. So that's kind of really where I see things right now from an entrepreneur standpoint. And yeah, Walter, if you'd like to jump in.
Well, Chris, I'm very excited about some of the new things that HTC is working on, and I think your introduction of eye tracking technology into your platform is going to make a really big difference. I think that for the research that many of you do in this room, being able to understand what people are attending to is significant. No, those aren't my slides. Let's see. Your slides are pretty cool, though. So we could. Yeah, these are mine here. Yeah. So let's start here. Actually, can I use that to sort of pace around a little bit? All right, thank you.
I don't know if it's on yet.
Okay, good. Well, one of the things I wanted to do as part of my job to try and entice, cajole, seduce, recruit those of you who might be interested in making that transition from basic research out into the entrepreneurial zone, or to collaborate with those who are doing that, is to give a little bit of an overview about the overarching landscape of what's going on in VR. I think it should also be mentioned, though, that the skill set that you have is the missing ingredient for many of the developments of applications of virtual reality. Many of the startups I meet that Chris was describing, how there's been a big surge of medical VR startups, I find myself always talking to them that they should not say they're trying to build a killer app if they're in medicine. It's just not the right way to describe it. But it's indicative of the fact that they don't have the proper mindset that for many of the groups, they're coming from the gaming arena or from the technology and sensor arena. They're not coming from the research arena. They're not coming from the clinical arena. And so they don't understand the value of validation and really showing what works, what doesn't work. So I think what the skill sets of the people in this room are really the missing ingredient for many of the startups that you see up there. So they're thirsty to collaborate with you, and they need your help and guidance. And the market in general, because this technology, and I'm going to spend a moment talking about, sort of the trends in the market. This technology is coming out so fast that we really need the people in this room to help us shape it the right way. VR is going to be the next computer platform. And as Chris mentioned, in China, that's becoming a priority for that country to say, we're going to make sure that we have a strong presence in this arena, a commanding presence. It's just an example of the fact that VR, AR technology is going to be the next wave of how we interact with each other, how we interact with information, how we interact with our work environment, our play environment, et cetera. And, I view that as a good thing. Many people are worried about the layer of technology between us and other people. I think we already have that with our cell phone technology, and I think VR is a much more cognitively engaging, much more robust environment, and a better way to have that layer of technology that is going to be part of our work environment. Now, I'm not adept enough to predict how it's going to be even in 5 years. Maybe we will have in 10 or 15 years smart cars that are our work environment that we can park in our driveway, and maybe we'll go out and it'll be a cab-based environment to do VR, and maybe we'll ride it someplace to meet with people in person, or maybe that'll just be our office. I don't know, but what I do know is that the layer of technology that's coming out is going to be part of our world. And it's going to be part of our research world and part of our clinical world. So I'm so glad that we're having this meeting today. Thank you for putting it on, Joanna, Andrea, and team. And again, I'm hoping that I can describe a little bit of what's going on to help entice you to jump in even more than you are. Right now, Chris mentioned, and I agree completely, we had a bit of a slow start. A lot of the applications of VR technology were in the entertainment and gaming space, and that can only go so far. And there was a bit of a slowdown, and some investors now are thinking that VR is more or less slowing down. However, if you look at the numbers, we're at an inflection point. And if you look at the rates of adoption compared to other technologies, such as the VCR, the color TV, the internet, the cell phone, the slope is that of what we're seeing in the adoption of this technology is much steeper. And that's because we're leveraging things like the cell phone and internet and PC technology. And I really do believe we're at this point where things are starting to take off in an asymptotic way. And the analysts, and again, sometimes they can be overenthusiastic, are projecting that by 2022, the immersive technology market will be a $25.8 billion market. That means it's going to be out there for sure in some strong way. It's going to be part of our lives. So what's the relevance to what we do? Well, again, I think really the full stack of healthcare and research is going to be impacted. And one of the things we haven't talked about very much today, we've talked about, aspects of all this, but I think it's especially for a research viewpoint, it's this aspect of a much more objective assessments and much improved interventions that's going to be really the key. One of the themes I've heard from earlier talks today is that in order to change a cognitive state, we need to be able to evoke a cognitive state. And we can do that in a much more robust manner with the affordances given us by VR environments. In order to study a cognitive state, same story, we need to be able to reproducibly evoke it in a regular manner, and I think that allows us to do that. So I'm going to skip over this section on training a little bit, but talk about why VR is so particularly engaging. And I think part of it is that it allows us to be actively involved. We can provide feedback of people's behavior and also physiological signals and processing. Again, we can leverage the power of story. And I think what's starting to emerge right now is the ability to, so far, a lot of the virtual environments are very isolating from a first-person perspective and just one person. And if there are more than one or more people in the environment, they often look like robots. But we're getting better at that, and I think the next wave of technology will have better participation in a multi-user manner. So let's see. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead to next section here. Oh, okay. There we go. Does this look familiar to people in this room by any chance? How many of you have been in this virtual environment? Okay, it's sort of the way many research labs traumatize visitors. They bring them in and they put them out on a plank and have them walk out, and maybe they're supposed to rescue a kitten or something like that, and they never screen for someone who might have fear of heights. And I've seen a few negative reactions because they don't do that. But the point is, we're able to evoke a cognitive state on demand, and I think that's in this case, extreme fear. But I think that's really where we're going to see a big surge forward, is coming up with better ways of assessing both activities of daily living, for example, but all aspects of neuropsychological assessments, etc. And I think it doesn't have to be in a head-mounted display manner. I think we have the ability to build rooms that we can step into, track our movement, track our gaze direction, track our behavior. And let me give you an example of a project we're working on right now. Oh, and I think we're getting better at using biomarkers in combination with these evocative environments where we can capture facial expressions along with other indications of psychophysiological data that can be used in combination with some of the behavior we see in these rooms. I want to tell you very quickly about a study that we did at our laboratory in collaboration with Lee Williams at Stanford University. In this case, we were trying to help develop a precision medicine model for diagnostics for depression. And what we did is we combined some of the neuroimaging data along with other assays, psychophysiological, et cetera, with the virtual reality stimulus in a longitudinal study of 400 people who have comorbid depression and weight management issues. We were teaching them through cognitive behavioral therapy some weight management and mood management skills. But I think the key part that I found really exciting was the combination of using virtual reality to challenge some of the neurocircuitry and correlate that with what we were seeing with some of the neuroimaging measurements. And the idea is to be able to identify brain circuits and come up with a new taxonomy of biotypes that could be identified at the primary care level using virtual reality as a way of evoking a standardized response. So we have a public database of immersive VR environments that we collected a modest amount of psychophysiological data with to evoke different cognitive states such as fear, disgust, anger, joy, etc. And we're hoping to build upon this, and we'd like to put a layer of other psychophysiological markers such as facial expressions and voice tones. Okay, that's my spiel for this part of it. Do we have time for a few questions? Okay, great. Why don't you go over?
Any questions to start with? I don't think you, did I see a hand? I saw your hand. Okay. I feel like an auctioneer a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris and Walter. I saw a headline, read a little bit of an article earlier this week that some of the handheld gaming VR was kind of in decline, or some of the major players had stopped developing. Is that true, and do you think that would be an obstacle to some of the entrepreneurial efforts? I'm thinking like Samsung Gear and Google Cardboard, I think was mentioned in the article, but I'm not sure if it's 100% true.
Well, I think we both probably have a perspective on that. I'll jump in. From my viewpoint, there's going to be a shift from entertainment and gaming as sort of the focus point of some of the early efforts here to what we call the enterprise, to the business enterprise, to being used as part of our work environment. And so this, to me, indicates an aspect of that shift.
Yeah, I would agree there. I think you might be referring to Google. Google actually announced a few days ago that they would no longer produce a Daydream headset anymore. So that might be what you're referring to. It is something that was phone-based, where you would just put your phone in front and strap it on. And I think Google kind of does things, and then they kind of change their minds quite a bit. So I don't think it's too much of a surprise for those in the industry, because we've kind of seen them step away a little bit from VR for the time being, and I think they're focusing more on AR at this point. But I would agree with Walter. Certainly there's been traction and growth in the consumer space with the release of standalone headsets, but also where we focus specifically, and a lot of other companies have been doing so. So previous VR game developers have all now moved to enterprise. They're doing enterprise training applications. They want to partner with folks like yourselves in the medical and research space, because that's where the funding is. Corporates, enterprises have money, they have budgets, they're adopting, they're seeing ROI, and that's kind of the key thing here, is they're seeing ROI, especially in training and collaboration and design and visualization. So that's where, again, the money and also the startup opportunities have been shifting a bit.
There's also been a shift to focus on large corporations actually spending money on employee health and wellness. And if we have a platform that's easy for them to use to push out interventions to help with addiction, alcohol, cigarettes, or to help with anxiety disorders that might be getting in the way of a productive work environment, or for recovery from an injury, those as VR and AR technology moves to the enterprise as part of what we do, as part of our work, maintenance and skilled labor training, I think we will see it as part of employee wellness, and that's really where a lot of the funding is right now.
Good morning. Great presentation. I actually have a question for Chris. You actually mentioned about the few pillars of entrepreneurship. Now, one of the challenges is when you're developing something new, whether you focus your efforts on developing IP, where it costs money, and when you have limited resources, and technology is changing at a rapid pace. So, where would you, as guidance to people who are trying to develop new things, are we better off focusing on product, making it better and actually cheaper, for example, from usability standpoint, as opposed to like going, let's say, file for patents, which is expensive? Thank you.
Yeah, I would say with regards to patents, if you're talking about future proofing and making sure you're relevant, remain agnostic in what you're doing, right? Have it evidence-based. The thing is that the market's very crowded. There's a lot of mindfulness apps, as Realitaire was one of them. But patent protection also has limited, it has its limits as well. So you just need to figure out what is going to put that barrier to entry up, what will kind of sustain you, and what will allow you to kind of continue, with and be kind of lean, right? So the lean startup mentality where you're not overspending, you're not overinvesting, and you're getting the most ROI for whatever efforts you're doing. And that's why I think hustle is kind of the key thing. Is we see lots of companies out there, and it's a little bit sad to see some that just kind of move away, right? They just don't continue, and sometimes it's because of their opportunity is there in front of them, but they just don't hustle for it. So I don't know another word to use, but maybe resilience would be another one, or just kind of being able to kind of not, you need to be laser focused, certainly, but you also need to be flexible enough to understand when it's time to move on and move to something that will propel you forward and continue your journey. So.
I think in the medical arena, if you have to choose, ideally you do everything. You secure your technology with protection, and you try and be the first to the market, and you build your brand. But I think what is really critically important, and if you have limited time or resources, I would prioritize, and that's validating what you're doing. In the clinical arena, that's really what is the foundation. You need to be able to say, there's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of people coming from the gaming arena who are standing up things, and they don't know how to, or they don't take the trouble to prove that what they have is useful and why it's useful. And I think that's the amazing thing that the people in this room know how to do. And so I would, I'm not going to say don't spend your time or money on getting a patent, but I'd say definitely spend your time and money on validating what you're doing.
We have time for one more question. I have one if nobody else has one right now. I'm wondering if you could comment on the opportunity for entrepreneurs to address privacy issues. So we know that there's a really rich stream of data coming from any immersive experience. And if you're in a game, maybe you don't care where that data is going, but obviously as clinicians, we have to care a lot. So it seems like an opportunity. I'm curious what you guys have seen in the space.
I think I agree with you. It's huge opportunity. I don't think people have actually been putting too much thought into it. So it is somewhat greenfield right now. And that's probably partly because I think people who understand privacy and HIPAA are probably looking for kind of assessment or treatment as opposed to the overarching kind of infrastructure question around data privacy. So I would see that as a great opportunity for folks who are understanding to really kind of jump in here and build some standards around it and build mechanisms to help enable other entrepreneurs and other medical research to become essentially safe and HIPAA compliant within VR.
I don't think it makes logical sense to say there are two third rails, but there are two third rails in this arena. One is this issue of privacy that everybody is trying to dance around, but really it's such a key issue, especially when it comes to the fact that being able to track gaze, being able to track motion, using machine learning, we will be able to understand so much about people's cognitive state, their behavior, their cravings, their predilections, just by how they're playing a game. And so I think we need to get on top of that fast. And I think, again, the expertise of some of the people in the room here can help us with that. I think the other third rail is the issue of safety. We talked a little bit about the developing brain, and we really don't know about how much time spent in a virtual environment is going to affect the developing brain in terms of vestibular, ocular, and other behavioral aspects of this, and conditioned feared learning. There are going to be a lot of very scary virtual reality games out there. And when parents work 3 jobs and their kids get parked at home and there's a virtual reality headsets, they're going to get exposed to some very scary stuff. So I think we need to get ahead of this and address those issues, because nobody else is taking the time or effort to do that right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing is that, so people probably don't know, but there is actually an industry group called the XRA, the XR Association. So it's a consortium of various headset manufacturers, ourselves, Oculus, Google, Samsung, Sony, and Microsoft. And so we do have health and safety subcommittees. We do have accessibility as well. Privacy, I think, is something that we're still haven't started addressing yet, but I know it's going to be coming up quite soon. But so there's opportunities there. If there's opportunities for collaboration or interest there, please let me know, and certainly can connect you.
Yeah, and I should clarify that when I say nobody's paying attention to the health and safety issues, I didn't mean on the industry level. I mean often in the research arena. I think it's an area where I haven't really seen any academic groups collaborating with that, or at least not enough.
So much. So lots of opportunities for future discussion. So we do have the workshops coming up to ask more questions about this. But I think right now we're ready to go on to the writing a fundable proposal and finding the best grant mechanism for your idea. So we're going to keep Chris Chen, and we're going to pull up our next speakers.
Ron, I think you're up first.
Am I first?
You want to be first? I think
Okay, all right.
In terms of the slides, you look like you're.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Chris, that was great. Thank you.
So I will actually say, in the interest of getting everybody's thoughts. In the interest of getting everyone's thoughts, I will let everyone introduce themselves, but I'll turn over the mic.
Okay. I don't know what it is. What do I need to do to make this go?
Sit down.
Is to, okay, great. Thank you. All right. Good morning. Certainly a very interesting meeting, and I'm happy to be a part of it. I'm Ron Hoover. I am retired now, but I used to be at Military Operational Medicine Research Program, and that's at Fort Detrick. And there I manage the clinical and psychological health research portfolio. So I have worked very closely with Joanne, and where she is now, but oh, there you are, on several of her projects, and that's really why I'm here. So what I'm going to talk about is, first off, is funding opportunities, and that's really what my slides are devoted to. And then after that, I have some sort of miscellaneous things that I've come up with since I've been at the meeting and understanding sort of what the focus is. So to move on here, what I would like to do is just talk about the basic funding mechanisms that we have, and they're listed here. I'm going to go through them a little bit more in detail, so I'm not going to spend much time here, but we'll move on to specific things. And I apologize, it's extraordinarily small print. But when I did it at home on my computer, I didn't have the ability to project. Is there, I think I'm gonna have to step out here to do this. So I'll talk loudly. So the broad agency announcement is.
Do you want a mic?
Oh yeah, sure, that'd be great. Oh, this will work. No, this is fine. I think this will work. Okay, so the broad agency announcement is an open year-round mechanism. It runs in fiscal years, but it basically is always open to submit projects. And you can submit any kind of project that you want that you think would have relevance to the military. Specific details about it. I don't know if you're familiar with the way we categorize money, 6.1, 6.2, 6.3. But you would need to probably understand that when you're applying, because 6.1 is for basic research, 6.2 is somewhere in between, so you have an idea and you're developing it and you're now planning to apply it to people. 6.3 is for more advanced and validated projects, and you're really looking at scaling it up to a large scale, and it's sort of the next step towards dissemination. Doesn't have any funding dedicated, but there is always funding that comes to us on an annual basis. So there is always funding. Let's see, and then I've included the websites too, so that you can go online and look for more information. Program announcements, those typically happen at the direction of a portfolio manager, where they're looking for specific research on topics that they have laid out as appropriate for submissions. Those always have funding attached to them. It's dedicated funding, and the funding is set aside, the program announcement is made. It's typically a pretty short window of application for pre-proposals, and then you get invited to submit full proposals, assuming the pre-proposal is of interest. Let's see what else we have here. Okay, so I think I'm going to move on to the next slide. And again, if anyone wants copies of this, because there are references to websites, you're free to provide it to people. Okay, so then we have small business innovation research, SBIRs, and small business technology transfer. And again, these have some very specific regulations associated with them in terms of how someone might apply. So for SBIR, it's typically a 500 for SBIR phase 1. It's a $500,000 cap on the award. For SBIR phase 2, it's a $1 million cap. There are some parameters in terms of how the money is divided. For SBIR phase 1, you don't have to have a partner. So as a researcher, you can submit and you don't need a partner. When you move into phase 2, you need partners because they're really looking for moving this out into the general population, and they recognize that individual researchers don't have that ability like you might if you had a much more established partner who knows how to scale up and disseminate that kind of help. STTRs are really small business. It's a formal collaboration with a nonprofit research institution, and the goal there is to absolutely move stuff out. And we develop the technology, and then it gets moved out into the general business community for dissemination and further development. For an example of SBIR, these happen to be ones that were from my portfolio. One that I can think of is in our lab at Walter Reed. We have a mouse model, and mice, when they're under duress, emit subarticulate communications. And so it's very difficult to record that and count, and when you're trying to evaluate and get your data for the study, whether it's an intervention and if this particular medication works to alleviate symptoms of PTSD. So they came up with the need for a automated system for capturing those articulations and classifying them, counting them, because that was the data. So they put out that idea, and then people submitted ideas for it. So, you know, these are oftentimes very specific techniques or research additions that help make the research easier to do, and then go out into the community so other people can benefit from that as well. Okay. Moving on to other transaction agreements, and this one is really important because it's new. And this is typically where you can partner with other companies. It's a lot more flexible in terms of a mechanism. Typically, everything I've talked about so far, you submit a proposal and it's either liked or it's not liked. And there's not really a lot of fine tuning or collaboration. This is a very collaborative mechanism. So someone can submit proposals, and if the portfolio manager finds those intriguing, they can indicate, yes, I'd like to see a full proposal. And then there's the ability to actually work with the individuals in terms of shaping the research, what specifically we need out of this. And if in my case, when I was doing this, if I knew someone else was working on something similar or it would fit in some way, I would say, well, you know, this is a great idea, but you need to work with this person, because I think when the two of you are together, you're going to be much more productive. And they bring something that you don't have, but I think you need in this study. So it's actually a very flexible mechanism. It does have some requirements. You have to join, and there's fees that range from $500 to $5,000 to join. But you know, if you think about it, if that empowers you to do this collaborating not only with the portfolio manager, it confers a nice advantage. Additionally, I think what I would say about that is that cost sharing is required, but it's typically pretty minimal. So someone might submit a proposal for $5 million and offer to pay $500,000, but there is an expectation that there's some collaborative funding happening. I don't know what else I want to say. Benefits really, I think, are you know, insight into government research needs. So if you're a member, you actually get public mailings and information funneled to you that isn't available to the general population about specific things that we might be looking for. I don't know what else I can say. I think I've covered most of that. One key thing is, you know, if you're a member, you have the potential to be on their board, which again offers further insight, even much closer to sort of where the ideas are coming from. And the last thing probably on that is, typically for all of our other mechanisms, you have a period of time where you submit, it either gets accepted or not. For this particular process, you can submit, and if the portfolio manager likes the project but doesn't have the money to fund it, they can set your project aside and wait till next year and use funding from next year to do that. And that's unique. The other mechanisms don't really allow that. So that allows the portfolio manager to plan ahead and say, oh, well, I've got this big project I want to launch. So when they get their budget, they can already set money aside to fund that. So anyway, that's a new mechanism, and I certainly encourage all of you to look at that. Oh, that I don't think is mine now. Okay, so I don't know how much time I have to talk more, but I can go down some opportunities or things like that, interests, if I have time. Okay, just quickly, within the military system, we have different research area directorates. So the one that I came from was operational medicine. And in that particular directorate, we had things that our topics were PTSD, substance abuse, blast, resilience, and readiness. And so I was thinking about the ways that VR can be applied to these topics. And so for PTSD, obviously we've done it for treatment, and we have done it a little bit for provider training. The VA out in San Francisco has developed a VR program for that. Other areas that I would think of that might be of interest for PTSD and more generally clinical and psychological health problems would be assessment. You might be able to use VR to do some assessment, particularly thinking about maybe in terms of PTSD. There's some research that suggests that people who have had significant childhood traumas may be much more likely to develop PTSD. You might develop an assessment program for what are our recruits coming in with in terms of their own history, and does that put them at greater risk for PTSD, and might that then indicate they should have additional resilience training. So that would be one way where this might be really useful. Another research area directorate is combat casualty care, and they do medic training and provider training. And I think a place, again, where VR would have an important role could be in training for medics in particular, and being able to put them in an immersive environment of combat and still give them the opportunity to rehearse their skill set, if that makes sense. And I don't think there's any other way you could really do that. But, when people learn in an academic setting and then they go into a combat setting, so many things are going on that this might help people to learn how to screen that part out and still focus on what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, so I'll wrap up real quick. We have rehabilitative medicine that focuses on pain, limb replacement, and regenerative medicine. There might be some opportunities there. We've already talked about the pain aspects, so I don't think I need to go into that. And then there's another organization called TATRIC. That's telemedicine and advanced technology. And so that certainly has a home for this kind of research. And then you asked me about who succeeds, who doesn't. Can I just say a couple key things? Okay, so for a research team, you'd want the normal complement of people that we all know need to be on that. One place where I think it gets overlooked is an ethicist. And there are particular challenges for ethicists in a military setting because people's lives are at stake. And for instance, if you, I guess the best example is in drug development. If you developed a drug that inhibited fear, people could fearlessly charge into combat, but that's certainly not very advantageous for their longevity. And so you have to really weigh carefully how you intervene and to make people do their job and do it effectively, but not disadvantage themselves, I guess is for the best way to put it. The other things that I wanted to say, who succeeds, because you also asked me that. Carefully plan your regulatory approval time. It always takes longer than you think. Next thing, have a good recruitment strategy. That always takes longer than you think. And in fact, recruitment, that's high on the list. Money. Be sure you carefully plan your money. And in my opinion, almost everybody comes back to me asking for more money. So plan accordingly. Overestimate a little bit because you'll probably need it. Without a doubt, you'll need it. So I don't know. Well-written pre-proposal, that's the first glimpse that someone like me would have of you and your work. Make it good. Don't make mistakes. Don't have grammatical errors because that's your first impression, and that's key to being considered for the next step. And I think that covers it. Thank you.
Thank you for cueing the slide for me after my disaster yesterday.
There you go.
Hello, everyone, and I probably represent the polar extreme of what you've just heard because I represent a small family foundation, which means that you have lay persons making decisions about how to distribute money according to a particular mission. But first, let me give a footnote. The VA DoD Task Force on Pain is probably one of the most important task forces in the US right now, and they're doing a remarkable job. So our hats are off to them. A little background on the Mayday Fund. It was created as a donation by a mother to her 3 adult children. And the idea was, could they work together? It would stay as one foundation, otherwise it would be broken up. If you're going to start looking for funding in the private foundation sector, you're going to learn a lot of particular stories. And there aren't a lot of patterns that are uniform across family foundations. And I think many of you in clinical care probably deal often with the grateful parent or the grateful patient. And some of what I'm going to say is useful as you're working in that space, because that's often a space for a lab getting a significant boost in terms of being able to pioneer a new project. Our grant making in the charitable space is roughly $1 million a year, which isn't a lot of money. We are working across the lifespan, as I said yesterday, and that means that we do a lot of work in neonatology as well as some work in geriatric medicine. We're probably less involved in the adult medicine space because those two areas are much more neglected in terms of the kind of exploratory funding that we give. We're really the folks who can support pilot work. And many of our grantees play the game of leveraging. That is, if they can take a Mayday grant and build it into a decent proposal for the NIH, then we all get to play this game of saying our 100,000 has perhaps leveraged into 1.2 million for 3 years if the project gets an NIH grant. So we're in that very mobile place you might want to be. You may be interested in why we're here in VR, and I have an extraordinary debt I owe to Skip Rizzo, Walter, Joanne, Hunter Hoffman. One of my board members' sons saw Skip on television about 5 years ago looking at virtual Iraq and told his mother he wanted to do something with VR. And this is a true story. I rang Skip up cold and said, can I speak with you about exploring the philanthropic work that might be done to look not at military medicine, but at human civilian medicine. Because as we know, within chronic pain, there's so much need, and there really aren't enough tools. I think we can all agree on that. And Skip very kindly agreed to jump on board, recruited Jeremy Bailenson and Walter. We managed to host a meeting, I think 4 years ago out in LA. We started making grants. We now have the grant you saw to Project Chariot. We also have a grant with Hunter Hoffman looking at eye tracking, waterproof VR headsets to be used in the burn tub at the Galveston Children's Hospital, the Shriner Children's Hospital, and it's going to move, I think, to the University of Washington. So we're in that space where if we can host a convening, we can hopefully get others interested in supporting the kind of work that we do. Probably, unlike the government, which can partner with industry, we have to be very careful. And that's where the ethics come into play when you're in the private foundation sector. So we're not good for the entrepreneurs in the room. We're probably the space where the researchers might wish to be. I thought I would take you through how getting a grant from Mayday works, and that's what this slide is about. I can't emphasize, if you're working in the foundation space, how important the mission of the institution you want to work with is. And you'd be surprised the letters of inquiry I get. And we have a two-step process, a letter of inquiry. And then if the trustees are interested, we invite a proposal. And if it's a scientific research proposal, we go for peer review. If it's for the robotic teddy bear, they just say, we can do a robotic teddy bear out of the generosity of our hearts. And the robotic teddy bear actually is being validated at Boston Children's Hospital. So, I mean, you do have to take it to that scientific level. Most of us all have websites now, and I think the foundation sector is probably much more transparent than other sectors in terms of listing the kind of grants that we make. If you go to our website, you have every grant from inception. That goes back to 1993. And it's really boring to read through, but it's also interesting if you like to do content analysis. The board has tried over time to take their interest in pain in different directions. What isn't there but is a central piece is that we're quite interested more and more in cross-species research. As we heard this morning about how the mouse model is informing the treatment of kids later on, there's this whole literature on the Grimace scale, which I spoke to some of you about yesterday, and how when you look at some of that face tracking technology that was shown in Skip's slides yesterday, if you paired the pain Grimace scale for children onto that, you'd probably have a very interesting biomarker. And that speaks to one of our grant-making categories that the trustees really care about, and that is trying to discover a pain thermometer. Because there's so much variability in diagnosis of pain, and any kind of biomarker that has been validated gives you that evidence to say that pain is real. And I was listening to the conversations this morning about fear and avoidance, and the obvious question is, at what point, instead of reporting fear, does one report pain, depending on the cultural world that you sit within, and to begin to think a little bit out of the box on some of those kind of things. In terms of figuring out who we all are, how do we present ourselves? If you look at our website, we've got 4 images that flash. One is of a boy with a bloody knee, another is with an older person's hand, another is a combat veteran, and another is a brain scan. We've done a lot of work with fMRI, trying to look for signatures of pain in the human brain. I think we'll continue doing that again on the pain thermometer way. When you have a chance to look at the goals of the foundation, you're going to have a chance to really see that buried in all of that rhetoric is a very clear message that they want to achieve something. So, and I made a joke about Gates up there, but you know, if you're the Gates Foundation, you want to eradicate polio or you want to do mosquito nets, they're going to be very specific about it. And I think they probably do more honest disclosure through the Gates and Melinda Gates newsletters than anything. And you can look through those more soft materials to begin to see, if you're building a proposal, what some of the questions are. If it's a family foundation, it's likely to be much less formal than we just heard with the Department of Defense. On the other hand, we've had the privilege of having the Pain Consortium at the NIH invite us to contribute funds to put VA data on a large Kaiser Permanente data set they were looking at, because we could offer that as an independent chain, which would increase the capacity of government agencies who can't very easily work together. So we sit in that very mobile space. I'm asking you here to remember with family foundations that you're probably going to be doing more interpersonal work if you're invited to meet a board. Walter's met our board, so he can give you some background. They ask really direct questions, and sometimes they're not as polite as you might wish they would be, but they really want to know, and yet they're not as informed as you are. So you learn another form of translation when you're working, especially in the small foundation set, and that is, how can you translate the sophistication of what you're doing to a message that somebody's going to get excited by. So you're always, when you're writing, we have a letter of inquiry, as I said, much like the DOD. You start with a preliminary and then you build from there. We're really interested more than anything else in the rationale. As a lay group, we want to know why this is important, what you think it's going to be. And it goes against scientific rigor to speculate, but we may ask you to speculate and say, where do you see this taking us? Not that we know you're going to get there, but it's what your plan is and what your plan of action is. And I must say, for people, when they start working in this kind of a grant application process, they often find it quite valuable because they're able to step out of their scientific box and into their planning box, if you like, where that's going to go. I always recommend that you use examples when you're trying to communicate something, and examples that are very translatable. The other thing I'm asking you to think about is checking with your colleagues. I mean, how many of you have had a friend or colleague tell you about a grant that they submitted and were successful with, and then you thought, well, I'm going to apply for that kind of a mechanism or grant? I mean, we're a society. That's how we all work. So be sure to use your own brain trust, if you like, which is what your network is. We also recommend, certainly with us, to contact us before submitting if you have any questions. I spend a lot of time going through letters of inquiry, helping people rewrite them to be sure that they're able to anticipate some of the questions my trustees might have. I think you'll find in the private foundation sector, you can have that kind of give and take, and that program officers are really responsible for being sure that you understand, in a sense of fairness, how the foundation is going to work. You can also, if you're invited to present, please consider accepting. We try to be gracious, and we usually limit it to an hour, and we give you a nice lunch. But it's also a way that people will remember the work you do. Because when you have a face-to-face, you've got that tracking mechanism that goes from there. When you're successful, would you please let us know what you're doing? Yeah, I can tell you how many people I chase around for reports. I mean, our grant letter is a contract like yours. It specifies an email every 6 months, certain financial accounting, all of a sudden everyone's off to the races. So remember that this is as formal because you are in a contractual relationship, and that's always going to be something that, because you'd like subsequent grants, it's a good idea to keep that up. And if anything goes wrong, tell us. I don't know if you know of stories where people get nervous if the experiment isn't working, the paradigm has to be changed, you somehow feel there may be an issue there. Our role is to be supportive of your work, and we know that there's going to be changes that happen, so don't be afraid in terms of that. After your grant is over, keep in touch. You'd be surprised how many times we've made repeat grants. There are a couple of labs up at Boston Children's that we're on the 8th grant that we're giving to them because the work they're doing has been cumulative, and the trustees think that that's important. Then the other thing, if you're not successful, keep trying. I think that we all get a bit demoralized when we don't get a grant. And if when you get a negative result or somebody says not at this time, that doesn't mean that it's not a good project. It means that it's a project that doesn't fit the profile of this kind of an organization. So in summary, when you're working in the small foundation space, you're really in a very human relationship as well as an institutional relationship. And you can use that to your best advantage to communicate your enthusiasm for what you're doing. And again, from the perspective of my trustees, and they asked me to say this, we really appreciate the work that you're doing. We think you're going to help more people suffer less. And so from our point of view, thank you. Any questions, or that's okay? No, we basically are at the level we're talking about here. It would be IRB approved research by junior faculty and up. And we usually do support the junior faculty level as opposed to the senior faculty level. Are you next? Yeah. Thanks. I hope that was useful.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about corporate funding mechanisms through HTC. If you don't know, HTC actually originated in the phone business. So we started 22 years ago, created the first Android phone, the Nexus phone, and then our own phones. But since 2016, we've been focusing on VR, and we're split into 4 different groups. So Vive's our brand that focuses on hardware. So the Vive, you might know about. I have one downstairs. Actually, I have the Vive Pro. The Vive Focus Plus is our standalone headset that's very much like you might have heard of the Oculus Quest, doesn't require a PC. Walter mentioned our Vive Pro Eye, which again, I think is really interesting because it has the eye tracking, which can provide a lot of feedback, a lot of biomarkers. And when you think about combining eye tracking with heart rate monitor, heart rate variability, other types of biofeedback mechanisms, that will be very powerful for the research you're doing. And the Vive Focus Plus, the standalone one that I just mentioned up top right, that will have eye tracking add-on. So there's a third-party company that is through our ViveX program, which I'll talk about in a sec, that is providing that starting, I believe, next month for pre-order. And lastly, our Cosmos headset, which just launched recently. So ViveX is our accelerator program, and that's kind of where we probably put our most funding in. You can see there's a deadline for applications. We've extended that to, just for this conference, no, I'm just kidding, but we did extend it to October 31st. So if you really want to try to rush something in, you certainly can. It's basically an accelerator program, much like 500 Startups or some others out there, located across 7 locations globally. You don't have to be physically there. We have a lot of companies and startups that are actually separate, remote. They just need to be there for initial meetings and also for demo days at the end. And it's a $100 million fund. We don't obviously dish out that much at a time because we've done it for over 100 different companies, and it will continue to do that for the foreseeable future. But we do provide strategic advice, mentorship, partnerships, support, and of course, networking and access. So I think the key thing here is, again, if you are looking for funding, some of the things we talked about in the last panel would be very relevant here. So Viport is another business unit of ours. It's really kind of our app store, if you will. They're looking to become the Netflix of VR. And I mentioned it here because I want to talk a little bit about that in the context of Vive Studios, which is the group I run. We traditionally focus on actually funding content production. So we produce content, work with developer partners, work with IP, work with folks in different areas. A lot of things have been consumer-driven, games, et cetera, but we've also done education, we do training, we've done some healthcare as well. In fact, one of the things we're looking to do, we are doing right now, is we're actually working with a company, a startup, that leverages eye tracking for cognitive assessment. So I can't really talk more about that besides that, but that's the kind of direction we've been heading in. We talked earlier about going from consumer to enterprise. That's what we've been doing. Quick, real just look at medical VR investment right now. You can see this, where is it? This blue box right here, medical. So it's roughly about maybe, I don't know, 10 to 12% of the total pie of investment for the first half of this year. But you got to think about the investment in medical VR being only 10 to 12% when it's really the number 2 item in our GDP. So I think there's this kind of there's a really opportunity here. The challenge is just looking at funding right now. Again, we talked a little bit about this earlier, there's a little bit of a tightening going on for kind of early stage companies. So the red comparative to this year, compared to the green last year, you still see some good, robust investments for Series A and beyond. So there's growth in the number of investors for more proven out customers. There's a lot more selectivity going on for the startups for early stage. And I'll just leave you with this. I think certainly ViveX is something that you should definitely consider. I think you need to certainly have a really valid business plan along with your evidence research and your developer partner. Vive Studios can be that partner as well. I mean, we work with a lot of developers, so we can help you guys find some. One of the things that Vive Studios is doing, which might also be relevant, is I talked about distribution. So we are also putting together, in partnership with Vipart, which is our app store, we'll be putting together some kind of way for enterprise content to be distributed. So if you're looking at business to consumer, that is one way, potentially B2B as well. And just running out of time here, so one of the things I did want to mention is that, is that there's obviously, you need to have the evidence-based research, and those requirements are critical in order to really be validated and to kind of stand up. But there is this dissonance with the timeline for traditional investors. It may not be so much for private foundations or DoD, but for corporate VCs as well. I didn't mention also, but HTC does invest on a corporate basis. So we will do Beyond ViveX, which is our accelerator program, Beyond Vive Studios, which does co-funding as well for content. Vive itself, HTC itself, does invest in early stage and companies as well, just more strategically. But it's a little bit of a challenge there because that's why I think there's that dissonance there, and that's why you're seeing not too many investments in healthcare and medical VR, at least from our standpoint. That's not to say that would change, but we were having discussions last night about, well, how do we actually speed up that process? Is there a way we can speed up trials? So the other thing is, and I did talk about this briefly, but some of the concepts and experiences, they appear similar, and that confuses investors. So how many meditation apps are there, both in the App Store for your phones, plus in VR? What's going to set you apart? Why should I invest in your app or your VR experience? And even if you have clinical evidence behind it, how are you going to be scaling? And that's really kind of the last thing that I wanted to kind of, again, mention is you really need to look for partnerships and collaborators. And as a company, we're always looking for collaborators and partnerships, but you would need to look obviously beyond just us. You would need to look to biotech, to pharma, to hospitals, to insurance companies. Those are really kind of your path to success for funding. And yeah, that's pretty much it from my standpoint.
I think probably will be a little more valuable in the workshops, but on the stats and methodology side, I just kind of want to talk about a few caveats. I often get handed a grant proposal 3-4 days before it has to go in with the plea for a power analysis. How many people do I need? And so some of this is a reminder that if you involve a statistician, biostatistician, methodologist early in the process, we can be a lot more valuable than just giving you a sample size and begging you for an attrition number. So for instance, in order to be fundable, you have to have a testable hypothesis. You can have a great idea, but if it's a vague idea, I promise Ron won't give you funding. So forming a testable hypothesis, being very careful about how you're measuring outcome. We often talk about what's your primary outcome measure, what construct are you measuring, or what are you interested in? How are you going to get a number on a piece of paper that I can analyze at the end of the study? Again, those are things as clinicians you tend to have sort of a more global sense about, and operationalization of a construct that you're interested in is something that a good methodologist can help you talk through. So it's important to get us involved at that level. Like I said, sample size, I think everybody understands. We have vague memories of power analysis from way back when. But one of the things that something like a Mayday Foundation or a smaller funding for pilot studies is extraordinarily important to answer that question. I think funders more and more are tired of seeing a medium effect size, the default. So if you have pilot data that you can back up why your intervention is doing what it's doing and what the size of the effect is, and not just guesstimating, but really have good pilot data to answer those questions, why these measures are sensitive. That's going to get you to a lot more precision in your sample size consideration. It's also going to then allow you to budget properly, because if you're using a measure that is fairly imprecise, or you're guessing at a medium effect size and you don't have one, you get 3/4 of the way through the study and realize you're not finding what you thought you were going to find, and then you have to go back begging for more. So all of that preliminary work is really very important and will help you hand in a really fundable proposal. Randomization is something a lot of the time that gets thought of at the end of the process instead of at the beginning. Without tipping our hand too much, I can say that the VR PTSD study that we're all being very quiet about right now turns out that the randomization choices that were made at the beginning are extraordinarily important in terms of what we're going to be reporting. So it's not just making sure that both arms have equal numbers of people in them. There's stratification decisions that are very important. And the more you know about your intervention and your target audience, your target patient population, the better decisions you're going to be making about that to appropriately power, but also to devise the analysis that reflects those stratification decisions. Data collection, again, I sort of get, oh, we usually put our data in Excel. That's fine, right? I start to twitch when that happens. So again, involving a good statistician, a good research methodologist who can help you find data entry. It feels boring when what you're interested in is getting your hands on, the VR or the really good outcome measure. But in the end, you will be deeply grateful that you have clean data, that you have it entered in a way that you can turn around really quickly, and you're not wasting the last 6 months of the study cleaning data and waiting for an answer when you really want to find out whether it worked and whether you got something. I think also just having another pair of eyes. I think Kasia and I both have had the experience where we may not be content specialists, although I've picked it up along the way. But to just sort of have a good scientific understanding of what is required in a good study. Sometimes when you're too close to the content, you forget that some of those assumptions may make a leap or two. And so having a methodologist, statistician to look at it and say, well, why does this measure the thing you think it's measuring? Why are you splitting the groups this way? Just to force you to answer those questions, forces you to write it out. And if a statistician has that question, chances are a funder or somebody on the review committee is going to have those questions as well. So it's better to have those asked up front to really make it a partnership and not the person you throw it at, 3 days before the grant is due in. I don't know, do you want to, I think Kasia probably can add.
I just have one comment, really, which has to do with new types of data we collect, particularly for computer-based applications. So this kind of data is quite messy. Therefore, it really pays off to talk to biostatistician or data specialist to make sure that it's captured the way you intend it to be. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I think we have time for one question. What we did was we gave them 10 more minutes. We're just going to push into the break a little bit so the next beginner panel has enough time. But I want to point out that we have not one, but two statisticians up here, and they're up here with people who are actually funders. The reason I did that is I really want to emphasize there are a lot of junior faculty and students in the room. Your statistician should really be your best friend and your chief advisor. They need to be part of the planning process from the initial idea that you have to turn it, to craft it into something that's executable as science, where you can validate your ideas and measure outcomes and keep your funders happy and write good grant proposals. And so I just wanted to come up here and say that it wasn't an accident that they're both here, that two people are here. And they're going to be dividing and conquering and going to the different workshops in psychiatry and pain and whatnot to help you all with generate ideas and think about things in terms of executable ideas. And so thank you very much. Where I think we don't, do we have time for questions or no? Okay. Thank you all so much. Really, really appreciate it.
So we have one more panel before we move on to the workshops. I am extremely pleased to introduce this panel on VR for beginners, but it's not just VR for beginners because I know we have plenty of people here who aren't beginners. It's also a highlight of student work in the area of clinical virtual reality. So this panel will be moderated by Swati Pandita, who, among many other roles, is a senior PhD student in the Virtual Embodiment Lab at Cornell and directing a project on affect and embodiment in virtual environments. So she will be introducing the students who will be speaking about projects that they've been involved in, and then before that, she'll be giving us a brief discussion of what you might not know about virtual reality if this is your first introduction to it.
Ask them a couple questions. Don't worry about it. Can you guys hear me? There we go. You got to hold it at the right angle. So good morning, everyone. I am Swati Pandita. I am a third-year doctoral student at Cornell University in the Department of Communication. I know, communication. So I will give you a little background about myself, and the panel members will also introduce themselves. But first, I have a couple of interactive questions for you guys. So obviously, it says beginning VR for clinicians. Not everyone here is a clinician. So let's just say beginning VR. But
if you guys could raise your hands if you have like been in VR before, you've used VR before. All right. Okay, so we have like a pretty experienced crew. So I have a lot of introductory slides. I'm going to skip over that because everyone has done an amazing job so far. But if you have any questions, we have a workshop right after this. I literally talk from like scratch to also then running projects in VR. So without further ado, thank you guys for answering my question. As I said, I'm a third-year doctoral student. And what actually brought me into the space of VR was that I was really interested in seeing how people perceive themselves in virtual reality. So I studied neuroscience in undergrad, and then while I was studying neuroscience, I was very interested in visual perception. So obviously there was that start of perception, but then I was interested in how do people interface with technology and how can I create technologies for emotional regulation. So I came to Cornell as a master's student and I studied human-computer interaction. But then I was like, I'm still not merging my why. Why does this happen and how can I make things that happen? So then I came into the space of virtual reality where I could study how the self gets transformed in VR. And my particular interest is in depression and how people's sense of self changes as their depression progresses. So without further ado, I actually want to introduce my panel members. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to change my slides so you can see all of who they are. So if you guys wouldn't mind just introducing your name and your what got you into VR.
Sure. So my name is Marielle. I graduated from Cornell University in 2018 with a degree in human development. And since then, I've been working as a research assistant at the Program for Anxiety and Traumatic Stress Studies, which for those of you who don't know, is directed by Dr. Joanne DeFede. And I've been assisting with a pilot study where we're using virtual reality as a non-pharmacologic pain management tool in the inpatient burn center. And with that, we're using virtual reality during dressing changes because they're extremely painful. And we're using a mobile-based virtual reality headset. It's a Samsung Gear. And one of the great parts about using that headset is that it's portable and can be brought by bedside. So it's been a really great study so far. We'll talk a little bit more about it as we go down the panel. But that's been my experience with VR. And this was my first experience using virtual reality, but it won't be my last because I think there's so many great avenues of using virtual reality in medicine.
Hi, everyone. I'm Josh. I'm a senior at Cornell main campus in Ithaca. I also work with Dr. Andrea Wan in the virtual embodiment lab. Why I got into VR. So I'm in the same department as the computer science school in Cornell. So that's what my background is, but I'm also very interested, passionate about healthcare. I'm going to medical school next year. So for me, VR is one of those emerging technologies that I was always interested in. And it's really coming into the mainstream right now. And hopefully later we can talk a bit about the projects I've been doing. And I've seen a lot of growth in this area, and it's very exciting.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hal. I'm an undergraduate at Cornell University studying biology. I got into VR through the program of anxiety and traumatic stress studies. However, I'm really interested in working with kids post-grad. So this summer I got to work at Lucille Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford for the Chariot program, which is a program that uses VR to reduce anxiety in pediatric patients. And for me, that was a really eye-opening experience because I got to see the benefits of VR in a clinical setting, especially with kids. And I'm really excited to talk about that as we go down the panel later.
Hello, my name is Harrison. I'm a high school senior at the Packard Collegiate Institute in Brooklyn Heights. I got interested in clinical VR like Hal through the Program for Anxiety and Traumatic Stress Studies under Dr. Joanne DeFede. What drew me to this particular type of work was my background's in computer science and not so much in medicine, but I wanted to try to find some sort of application where it would have a more broad impact. My work would have a more broad impact and actually directly affect the lives of people in a meaningful and positive way. And so when I discovered that virtual reality is being used in that fashion, it really seemed like the perfect opportunity for me to harness my passion for computer science, but also have a greater impact on the people around me.
Hi, everyone. Hi, guys. My name is Jessie. I'm also a senior at Cornell studying information science, and I am also a research assistant at Dr. Wan's lab, the Virtual Embodiment Lab up in Ithaca. My background is more in film and game design, which are my minors at college. So I learned about virtual reality more in an entertainment context, and I was interested in going into research so I could look into how virtual reality as a technology could be used for other purposes.
Thank you, everyone, for your introductions. Another question to the audience. So how many of you guys have actually designed VR studies? All right. Okay. So we do have some slides for you. But first, I want to ask the panel, how did you guys, all of you pretty much are still new to VR, your experiences are very fresh. How did you find like using the VR technology for the first time? Was it hard to learn?
I guess I'll speak to that. For me personally, I had some background, not in virtual reality development per se, but just in computer science in general. So I was able, the hardest part for me was not so much on like the programming side, but actually like the visuals and the animation and making it seem like an immersive experience and not a dizzying experience was something that was like kind of a fine line that you have to stride. So that was a bit hard to pick up initially, and I'm still learning, but I think that but having my background in more like straight programming was definitely helpful when I had to start looking at like the how these simulations operate and the logistics and all that.
Yeah, so my first VR experience was when I picked up a Samsung Gear in 2016 when VR was first becoming consumer tech. And I think for me, it was pretty intuitive. I think, Samsung and those commercial companies do a great job of making it pretty accessible to most people. When I entered the research environment and I started working with like Code and Oculus and HTC Vive, I think there's definitely a large learning curve there, and you definitely want to work with CS people to like develop projects and get your study started up. But initially, I think once you like pick up one of those consumer products, it's very easy to envision applications in medicine or anywhere else.
All right. And also, I know some of you have experience running participants. Could you say anything about how they interacted with the virtual environments? Some of them might have been there for the first time, or maybe some of them already had the experience. Could any of you guys comment on that?
I can comment on that. So with our study, we actually had one participant who wasn't eligible for the study, but I went to go approach her just to show her the equipment because I heard from the Burn team that she was a gamer and has experience working with VR and also just other games. So when I went to go talk to her, she was so excited that I brought her the equipment and said, I've been sitting in bed all day by myself. I'm really bored. I have no one to talk to. And she said, you made my day by bringing me this equipment. And I was like, if we can make such an impact showing her the equipment for 10 minutes, I mean, think about what impact we can make on so many other people. And she had so many questions about the uses of VR and if she could buy her own headset. And it was just so amazing to hear how excited she was about using the equipment.
I can also speak to this a little bit. So When I was working for the Chariot program, we were doing a study in the orthopedic clinic, and the study was we wanted to lower kids' anxiety when they were getting their casts removed. Now, I don't know if anyone here has actually gotten their casts removed, but you'll know that it's not actually a painful procedure at all. But you can imagine if you were like an 8 to like 13-year-old, this can be very scary just because it's a loud saw and it's like it looks scary because it's a saw. So there was this there's this one time where we went into like go recruit a patient, and they were about like 6 or 7 years old, and they were like hysterically crying, like they were like really nervous about this. So we didn't even try and enroll them. We just gave them the VR headset, and we're like, yo, just like play with this, like it's fun, like you're gonna have a good time. And it was really amazing to watch. Like the kid like was crying a little bit in the headset, but after about like 30 seconds, like they were totally chilled out. Like they were playing this, like, it's this game called Pebbles the Penguin. You were a penguin sliding down the ice collecting coins. But yeah, it was just like, for me, it was just a very powerful experience because you really got to see the benefits of VR. And that's something that it's very difficult to put that on paper and put that into numbers. But being there and watching that, like you really just got to see the power of VR.
All right, thank you guys. I have one more question regarding running participants. Did any of you guys find any difficulty explaining how to use the VR system to your participants, or was it pretty straightforward?
I mean, I can talk about the equipment that we're using. Like I said before, it's a Samsung Gear headset. It's been very easy to use. We've actually had very few technical difficulties using the equipment itself. We've had some other challenges that I could speak to afterwards about just like recruitment and design of the study. But otherwise, going into the study, I thought there were going to be a little bit more challenges with using the equipment and Wi-Fi and making sure that there weren't any problems with it running, and we've actually haven't had any issues with running it in a hospital setting, which has been really great.
Awesome. Josh and then Jesse?
Yeah, just adding on to Marielle, we worked on the same study, and there's a bit of a disparity. So we tested on pediatric patients and also geriatrics. The younger people, they pick it up pretty quickly. Even if they haven't been in VR, it's pretty intuitive for them. For the older patients, they're definitely like, it's a bit obvious, but they do have struggle in the beginning, and they might ask you like how to move around in the environment, and they might be a bit disoriented, but after a few minutes, they actually pick it up pretty quickly as well. So I think for most people, shouldn't be a huge problem.
Before we continue to Jesse, I just wanted to mention, so a lot of the time when we run VR studies, one of the first things we ask is make sure that our participants aren't prone to nausea, disorientation, or any type of seizure disorder that could really inhibit their balance. And sometimes as you get older, when your vision is totally obstructed by a headset, that too, they are getting lighter, and but even then, you're still putting about 3 to 5 pounds of weight on your head and trying to learn how to use a novel device. So you do want to be really considerate of the people that you're asking to use your VR intervention. So with that said, thank you guys. Jesse, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Sure. So I can speak a little bit more from the perspective of working in our lab of in Ithaca, although I haven't worked with any patients like other members of this panel, because most of our participants do tend to be undergrads. Some of them have experience using VR, but a lot of them actually don't when they come in. For some of them, it's their first time using it. But I think that it's more the fact that we use like consumer products in our lab that it's very intuitive for people to pick up what to do. And like you said, like we always preface this with before they even put on the headset, we sort of explain what the controllers are, how to hold them, and that really like helps with the flow and helping them like get used to the experience.
Yeah, and what we're also trying to iterate here is while everyone is starting to get to know way more about VR, sometimes as a VR scholar, you are put in that position where you need to educate a little bit more to your participants or your patients. So we would just like you guys to be aware of that when you are designing your studies. With that said, as you can tell, our panel has an amazing host of experiences, and I'd like them to share them with us. So if you guys could tell everyone your most, I guess, favorite VR experience.
One experience that I had, which I thought was really exciting, was I was at the 3rd Avenue Street Fair passing out flyers and showing people our equipment. And I had a swarm of like 20 kids surrounding me wanting to try the equipment, and a lot of angry parents who were like, we need to leave. The kids would not take off the headset. They were glued to the headset. And just seeing how excited they were by, trying this new world and being in, seeing something that they haven't really seen before, a lot of them, I think is really great, and just shows that there can be a lot of uses in pediatric populations as well.
So this summer, I actually worked at Wright-Patt Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, and I was working with a team, and we were trying to test out non-pharmacological interventions for people in aero evacuation environments. So one of the things that we were playing around with was VR, and it was really cool for me to see service members utilize VR in like planes, and then seeing like all the considerations that you have to take into account. VR was just one of many things that we tested, but that really showed me like the breadth of like application of VR, and it was really exciting.
I think the most positive thing that I saw when kids were using VR is, so when I was running these studies, we couldn't actually obviously enroll the same participant twice. That's like very obvious, but I would just always get like very excited and very happy when we would see the same kids coming back into clinic, especially for the ENT clinic, where they'd have to get like regular nasal endoscopies. And we would literally have doctors contact us beforehand just to be like, hey, can you guys come in and bring the VR again? Because these kids really, really enjoy it. And for us and everyone that was working at Chariot, that just like showed how VR just was benefiting even the clinicians, because the clinicians like saw it and wanted us to keep coming back with this great technology.
So I don't really have much experience working with patients or people and seeing their reactions in VR. But for me personally, something that stuck with me was, I remember the first time that I tried BraveMind, which was mentioned earlier today and yesterday. I had read the research studies about it and I had seen the pictures, but then I remember when I actually tried it and I could actually see like the breadth of the simulation. It's totally different than seeing it on paper. It's really like, it really struck me and confirmed my, not hunch, but confirmed my inclination that this work is really, really meaningful when I saw that.
I would say, because I'm currently working on one project with eSwati, and the first project that I had in the lab when I joined about 2 years ago involved a network virtual reality environment. I think one of my favorite moments was when I first spoke to somebody within VR. Even though we were in separate rooms physically, it felt like we really were in the same room because I could hear them directly speaking to me, and I could sort of see like some of their gestures. So that was a really like kind of eye-opening moment for me.
Cool. So thank you guys for sharing your experiences. Given that some of you have had experience running participants and then also designing virtual worlds for participants, could you guys tell me some design considerations either on the research side or on the development side that you guys kind of came across as like your go-to things that you should take to mind?
Yeah, so I can speak from a research perspective on design considerations. One thing that came up as we were talking about the study is whether we should, like how to administer the self-reports with minimizing the disruption of the immersion into the virtual world. Right now we are asking the self-reports like the one asking the patient the questions as they're in the headset. But at the same time, it would be an interesting thing to do is to actually use the headset to ask the questions so the patient can answer the questions within the virtual world, and that can be incorporated more so that the immersion is not lost. In addition, I think another consideration that came up was the VR versus the control groups and kind of making sure that both groups, their care is the exact same. One thing that I noticed was that when the virtual reality group was getting their dressing changed, a lot of times because they couldn't see what the nurses were doing, they would ask, like, can you please walk me through every step of it? And I think the nurses talking them through it and kind of approaching their care a little bit differently could have some kind of impact. And then there was also the component of every time, we were in a tank room while they're getting their dressings changed, and doctors and nurses would walk in and, be like, oh, like, what game are you playing? How fun. And like, that would also break the immersion a little bit. So these are all some considerations to take in mind if you're looking to design another research study. If you want to talk about the clinical considerations.
Yeah, so I started researching in VR in a academic setting, and then I moved over to the clinical side afterwards. And there's definitely like a host of challenges which comes with that, very real world problems. So first of all, clinicians are all very busy people, so collaboration with them may be a bit difficult sometimes. You have to really like schedule around what they're doing during the day. Something that other speakers have touched on, definitely like infectious diseases and just like sanitation. So I guess just speaking from my experience, I worked with Joanne in her lab, and we were running a pilot study in the burn center, and we were ready to just roll out, get started, and then epidemiology contacted us, and after approving it before they raised questions about like sanitation and procedures and how we were going to prevent diseases from spreading. So we had to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to, keep these considerations in mind. And so that was a delay, but we managed to, work around that. We're using surgical caps now. We're using like replaceable or like
Disposable liners.
Disposable liners. Yeah.
Silicone straps.
Yeah. So we've worked around that, but definitely just like keep those roadblocks in mind when you're designing your studies.
I guess, so just going off of what Josh said a little bit. So Josh and I worked on a project, not in the summer of 2018, again, for burn victims, but although it's a little bit different than the study that Josh was mentioning a few moments ago, because this study was meant to be representative of the actual situation that the user's in. So that sort of brought with it like a whole host of design considerations. So like I said before, my experience isn't really on the clinical side, but I do have some insight on what I had to consider when actually designing the program. So one of like the main considerations is that in this simulation, the user will be able to see their own virtual body. And in order to create the most immersive experience and not raise any sort of questions or concerns, that avatar needs to be representative of the person that's using the simulation. So that's not just applicable to the placement of their burn injury, but also to their race, their gender, their height, their weight, and any sort of characteristic that can be seen physically that would increase that immersive intensity. And so that's something that will ultimately be easily customizable by a clinician who is administering this form of treatment. But as it currently stands, that's not something that we've had the opportunity to develop in depth, but it was something that needed to be taken into consideration when constructing the avatar and making it so that they have the ability to be modified and customized when that time comes.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that. Definitely, like when you're designing avatars, the you want to make it very realistic and very true to life, but our lab has shown, some things about the avatar, the user just doesn't care about at all, and others are more important. So maybe it's like very imperative to get their skin tone right or the burn injury placement right, but other things like their height, that won't matter. So you probably have to figure out what's important and what's not.
Yeah, kind of coming off the point of modifying avatars, because as I mentioned, we do use consumer products. While that does come with a lot of pros in terms of having equipment that works very easily and that's very intuitive for our users, the project that we're currently working on, the CS students on our team spent a big portion of last year working on how to transform movement, because while we don't have a motion capture suit that has many points, instead we have 2 controllers and 1 headset, we only had 3 points to work with. We had to figure out how we could transform movements while still keeping it looking realistic based off what the participant was actually doing.
Thank you guys. So Josh, Harrison, and Jesse raised great points. One thing that you have to consider with VR, and especially with any type of IRB as well as other administration processes, is you are often setting precedents, right? So you have to, as we saw in the grant proposal presentations right before us, you have to keep and allot for time in which you are explaining why are you doing these things, but also how are you doing these things. And sometimes it has to start at a very beginner level. So just keep that in mind. You are some of the most patient scholars that are out there. And also, as Harrison pointed out, in VR, we are using a lot of technologies, and part of that is, we design our own environments and we embody our participants in avatars, and those can vary in terms of photorealistic fidelity as well as behavioral fidelity. So how much do we move around in the environment, as well as is the physics or are those movements actually mirrored in real life? So when we are designing for these things, we have to be considerate of what our participants or our patients' expectations are. So thank you guys for bringing up all of those great points. I also have a couple of slides talking about a couple more patient considerations. So going a little bit back to the basics, as you guys were introduced in yesterday's presentations, we have different types of gear. So you have to think about how much space do you have to move around. Some of your patients, they might not be very mobile. So maybe a Go would be, or a untethered headset would be your best benefit. And also limited movement too. So maybe you don't want to use your controller. So do you want a portable invention? And realize that tethered VR, while more powerful, it does require a lot more space. And sometimes that is a design consideration we don't really think about until we're running. Also, how much movement are you anticipating? So in one of my studies, we have a full out room with mirrors that almost looks like a dance studio. And so our participants want to move around the whole room, but we have to make sure that that room is actually mapped physically to the virtual room so that they aren't bumping into the walls. And as I said earlier, think about whether or not your patient is bedridden, or even when especially doing pain management, are they what are the placement of their IVs? And also, do you want to track movement? So there are certain headsets that will only give you positional information, so your XYZ information. But if you also want rotational information, like how am I swaying my head, which can be very helpful in terms of tracking eye gaze, you might want to use a tethered system or a system that uses 6 degrees of freedom. So make sure to consider your degrees of freedom. Other design considerations, as our panel had brought up, is the headset easy to clean? especially if you're using it in a hospital environment, you are going to have a lot of regulations that you need to consider and also communicate. And as we said, we have sanitation masks. One other thing is that these headsets don't always fit all participants. So sometimes, especially with our Oculus headsets, the nose bridge is a little too high. And what happens is if you have a flatter nose, you have this gap between your headset and your nose bridge. So you can see the floor, you can see a little bit of the physical space, and one might argue that it might decrease a participant's level of immersion in a space. Also head size. So these are not, while our headsets are pretty flexible, they have Velcro straps, it is still a little one size fits all. So you have to accommodate that as well. Other things, as Harrison had pointed out, does your patient need a full-bodied avatar, or is just having hands in an environment enough? Also, make sure to patient-proof your environment. One thing I had mentioned earlier is you do want to make sure there's enough space for you and your participant to move around freely so that they don't bump into anything. And of great importance, and you always want to spot your participants or your patients as well. Especially, it is so very easy to knock into counters. I will say a lot of these virtual environments can be distracting for even you as a researcher, because you're so enticed with how your patients are enjoying the environment or interacting with it. So just remember that you're also there to ensure their safety. So do realize that certain individuals are more prone to injury in VR. As we had said, the first thing that we ask our participants is to make sure they are not prone to nausea, disorientation, or any type of dizziness. This also includes pregnant individuals. We don't want to put them at any risk. So healthy patients may report feeling nauseous or dizzy in a virtual environment. So do be aware of this. Our typical protocol is to have them sit down and wait until those symptoms are gone and make sure that they're all good to go. So with that said, I apologize, my resources slide got a little frazzled, but I'd like to thank you all so much for being here today. And I have one last question for my panel, and it's more of a, how do you see the future of VR? In particular, what are some cool futuristic clinical applications?
Sure. I think the most exciting part about VR in medicine is that there's no limits to what can be done, as we've seen in the past day and today as well. I mean, there are uses in, prolonged exposure. There are uses in anxiety and mindfulness reduction. There is, uses in boredom, in emergency rooms, and patient education. And I think there's just no limit to what can be done. And I think personally, I think what is most interesting to me is using virtual reality in musculoskeletal pain and rehabilitation. So that would be one avenue that I would like to explore a little bit more.
I definitely think in medical education, definitely. So a previous speaker mentioned, for surgery, having VR environments and using it to visualize, human anatomy. I know. I was talking to a urological surgeon over at Stony Brook, and they've actually implemented VR into their surgical training already, and I think that's pretty cool. And it shows me that VR is already permeating into the medical education world. So definitely would like to see more of that.
I think it would be great to implement VR more into surgery. So, I mean, definitely before surgery, a lot of people have a lot of anticipatory anxiety. I think it would be great to have VR headsets before surgery, just so everyone can distract themselves, because no one really likes to just sit there and read the paper. And I think that maybe even after surgery too, just to reduce opioid use. That could definitely help with like nausea and addiction and everything related to that. So I definitely think that VR and surgery would be a productive way to go.
I think that the psychiatric implications with virtual reality are very interesting, like how it can be used to treat these sort of very specific and niche almost disorders that people suffer from, and how such as like specific phobias or very pinpoint fears that are triggered in a given environment or in a given circumstance. And if that can somehow be implemented, not necessarily in like a hospital setting or in like a like in like a session, but could be implemented at the discretion of the user when it's necessary. I think that's a very interesting application.
It's kind of similar to that. I think that VR would be very interesting to be used for at-home treatments, especially in personally looking at the two studies that I've worked in. Number one being in a networked environment, if you were to talk to someone like a psychiatrist while still being in the comfort of your own home without having to get dressed and leave in the morning. And because that study was focused on the effects of social presence, I think I could definitely have some applications there. And also similarly in the project that I'm working with you on, which you can probably speak a little bit more to in terms of affecting movement or posture and trying to see if that has an effect on somebody's emotions.
Thank you for that introduction. I think we're out of time for questions. All right. All right. I will give this mic to you and then head back to the podium.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was fantastic introduction to your experiences. I had a kind of logistical question that I think is really important to research, and I'm curious if you have any insight. I'm helping to run a study right now that uses EEG and virtual reality to explore a hospital environment. And one thing that I've been used to for my years of running studies is getting exact time markers of events. And VR software does not yet seem, for example, like Unity, really clearly ready for time-locked event signatures. We just kind of recently discovered, so there's some these print functions in Unity, but I'm just curious if you guys have an experience with like that, if that's something that you've had
Oh,
to deal with.
yes. So thank you for bringing up that question. One thing that I didn't mention is some of the measures that we use are event-related measures. So basically we code for button presses as an event to be an indicator of that event. And we also track the movement data. So one thing that we did recently with event measures is we had a VR learning environment, and in it we had a couple of quizzes, but we also had interactions that we labeled as events. So in this environment, participants could basically teleport from above the earth to on top of the earth. And we wanted to know when they did that in relation to some of the questions that they answered to see, okay, if they are actually trying to interact with the environment as they are reading this question so that they could figure out more information. So yes, you can, but it wasn't, what can I say? It was something we had to code for and create. It wasn't something that we could just get off of the shelf, but I'm sure our lab, the virtual embodiment lab, would be more than happy to talk a little bit more during the workshop.
Share scripts if useful.
Yes, share scripts. But it is doable, I will say. Did you guys want to add on or? One more question?
We can just go to the coffee break. So the perfect timing. So I want to first thank the Future of Virtual Reality Research. So please continue your good work. And then I also just want to make a quick announcement about the workshop. So you'll have an opportunity to ask more specific questions in the VR for Beginners workshop, which will be happening after the coffee break downstairs. So we'll have all of the gear set up there. And then the other two workshops on psychiatry and education will be taking place up here. And the room will be divided. So we'll have psychiatry over here. Is that right? Education over here, and then psychiatry on the other side. I want to mention one more thing, which is the goal of this symposium was for us to meet each other and begin to spark conversations about collaborations, funded collaborations in the future. So we've created a little template for, and this is, speculative, so it's not a big commitment, but it's a way during the workshop for you to get into groups and talk about projects you might want to do and sort of fill in this template with the names of the people you're talking to. And as the workshop leaders are circulating around, if you have questions like, well, I wonder what kind of hardware I would actually need for my project, or I wonder what kind of funding mechanism might be something I would want to look at. We have sections in the template that we can fill out, and then we will share that information back to you after you leave, so you have a little memento of what you talked about, and also we hope a way to push this project forward perhaps in the future. So we'll show that link again, but it is now on the agenda, and we'd love it if workshop participants would use that as a basis. And of course, we will only give your ideas back to you. We won't steal your great ideas. All right, let's go have coffee.